Hey everybody, this is the third chapter of part 3 of Ingo Elbef's Marx in the West, the new reading of Marx in the Federal Republic since 1965. Part 3 of the book is titled The Crisis of Revolutionary Theory, and Chapter 3 is titled Critique of Political Economy versus Objectivist Model of Revolution. Let's see, one second, let me find my spot here. Okay. Alexandrina Moll, too, identifies two contradictory conceptions within Marx's work, an objectivist model and a practical model of emancipation. Unlike Meyer, however, Moll regards the traditional juxtaposition of a humanistic, practical early period and a scientific, historicist later period as a fundamental misconception of Western Marxism. While the early works already exhibit an ambivalent theory of revolution, the objectivist component of which is organized around the causal nexus of, quote, worker exclusivism and the, quote, immiseration theory, is precisely the socioeconomic context of justification within Marx's Capital that must be understood as a refutation of this approach. Moreover, these contexts can only be rendered intelligible against the backdrop of a practical conception of emancipation. 1. Moll regards both the theory of absolute immiseration and its causal link to the emergence of revolutionary action as a legacy of contemporary bourgeois concepts. A pessimistic assessment of the development of the material situation of the working class, taking the form of a demographic wage theory, has, since Smith and clarified by Mill and Say, been a commonplace of bourgeois economics. Wages, it was held, could not permanently rise above the physical subsistence minimum, or if they did, the workers' higher standard of living would cause the working class population to multiply, which would ultimately lead to the supply of labor exceeding demand, thereby driving wages back down. In the Paris manuscripts, Marx explicitly draws upon Smith's account of the various economic scenarios regarding wage development. According to Marx, the wage, determined by the interplay of supply and demand, and averaging out as the subsistence minimum, might indeed rise in the most favorable conceivable scenario, that of, quote, growing wealth, end quote. Yet it would nonetheless result in the, quote, complex misery, end quote, of the proletariat. For a wage increase leads to overwork, as laborers, infected by the greed of capital, sacrifice all their leisure time in an effort to further augment their earnings, thereby shortening their very lifespans. Moreover, increased wealth signifies the growth of capital, and thus the expansion of the alien property confronting the workers, as well as a progressive division of labor that reduces the human being to, quote, one-sided, machine-like abstract activity, end quote. Increasing capital wealth also augments the number of workers, thereby intensifying their competition among themselves, which ultimately drives down their wages. Competition among capitalists brings about the progressive concentration of capital, the descent of former capitalists into the ranks of the wage-dependent masses, heightened competition within these ranks, and consequently the starvation of those who succumb to this in the struggle. Finally, the mass of commodities, swelling as a result of the growing volume of labor, triggers a crisis of overproduction, resulting in unemployment or the reduction of wages to a bare minimum. Thus, for Marx, quote, even in the state of society most favorable to the worker, the necessary consequence for the worker is overwork and premature death, reduction to the level of a machine, servitude to capital, which accumulates dangerously against him, new competition, and, for a section of the workers, death by starvation or beggary, end quote. Even in the Poverty Philosophy of 1847 and the Manifesto of 1848, one finds a theory of immiseration, specifically a, quote, subsistence minimum theory, end quote, of wages, albeit without Marx embedding it within a distinct, fully elaborated economic framework. In Wage, Labor, and Capital of 1849 and the manuscript Wages of 1847, this approach is continued, yet it is simultaneously refined through a differentiation, not merely between nominal and real wages, but between absolute and relative wages, defined as the share of immediate labor in the new value it has created, relative to the share of that value accruing to accumulated labor, i.e. capital. Building upon this, Marx formulates a consumption-centric theory of relative immiseration, grounded in the widening divergence between the portion of wages expended on the enjoyments of the worker, and the portion of profits allocated to the enjoyments of the capitalist. This approach, which still associates capitalism with the production of luxury goods for a select few, rather than conceiving of it as a system of value production as an end in itself, a system in which profits must necessarily be accumulated, was, according to the author, uncritically perpetuated within traditional Marxism. However, neither does Marx in Wage, Labor, and Capital yet develop a theory of relative surplus value, one that would allow for an explanation of the economic causes leading to a reduction in the value of labor power, nor is he able to substantiate the tendency toward relative immiseration, as he provides no data, regarding the rate of growth, of wages and surplus value. Furthermore, a tendency toward absolute immiseration cannot be substantiated using Marx's arguments either. According to Marx, the de-skilling of labor, a process accompanying the division of labor, renders, the particular skill of the worker valueless, thereby reducing the value of labor power. Marx, it is argued, draws an impermissible inference from the declining cost of reproducing labor power to a decline of wages in real terms. Furthermore, the increasing intensity of labor, which is frequently cited, does not necessarily affect real wages, but rather the ratio of variable capital to surplus value. From an examination of the development of Marxist theory up to 1850, three conclusions may be drawn. First, a theory of both absolute and relative immiseration can be clearly identified therein. Second, however, this theory remains under the influence of, and is grounded in, the empirical evidence adduced by bourgeois political economic analyses. It cannot be substantiated by any of the original Marxian theorems, which at that time appeared only in embryonic form. Third, the observation regarding the derivative nature of Marx's economic thought during this phase, as well as its subsequent transformation in his later works, has, right up until the 1950s of our own century, failed to prevent any interpreter from basing their demonstration of a Marxian economic theory of immiseration precisely upon these early writings, without ever mentioning the corrections applied to them in his magnum opus. Heading 2. However, in his early works, Marx not only espouses a, unoriginal theory of immiseration, this theory also exerts an influence on his conception of revolution. Yet even in this regard he continues to follow the contemporary discourse, a point Moll substantiates by means of a synopsis ranging from conservative to social revolutionary positions. The causal nexus between immiseration and revolution can be traced in Marx's work from the Introduction to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right all the way to the Manifesto. Admittedly, in the Introduction and the Holy Family, one can still find divergent theses regarding the French and English proletariat, specifically the notion of a sui generis, or naturally evolved, revolutionary potential inherent in that class, which Meyer termed the instinct theory. However, what is posited in the Introduction with respect to German conditions is later found to apply to the proletariat as a whole. Namely, the denial of any autonomous positive motivation and capacity for self-liberation, and the construction of a causal link between material deprivation and revolutionary action. In this framework, the proletariat effectively constitutes a extraterritorial class of the propertyless, a class whose existential condition represents the culmination of material misery and dehumanization, and which, therefore, within the context of a speculative dialectic of emancipation, and entirely independent of the goals and insights of its individual members, is compelled to assume the role of the self-negating, quote, negative side of the central socio-structural antagonism. Thus, revolution is already conceived in the early works as a, quote, necessary consequence of circumstances, and quote. In this context, the model of emancipation, exclusive to the working class, relies solely on a theory of immiseration, a theory which, in a strictly economic sense, was only articulated starting with the 1844 manuscripts. 4. From the determinations of alienated labor, no class-specific revolutionary interest can be derived. Due to the constraints of political economy, the capitalist, too, treats his species being, his social relation to other human beings, as well as his specifically human capacity, quote, for free conscious activity, quote, as mere means, quote, though not merely for his physical existence, but for abstract enrichment, quote. His activity is not an expression of self-realization, but is rather subsumed under the imperatives of capital valorization. Finally, the products of activity confront not only the worker, but also the capitalist as a, quote, independent power. As value objects, they are largely withdrawn from his control, just as they remain a matter of indifference to him as material use values. The products expropriated from the worker, so argues Moll, drawing upon Wolfgang Port, serve merely as bearers of a value to be largely accumulated. Unlike in pre-capitalist modes of production, they do not serve to advance the cultural and material wealth of the economically ruling class. The unpaid surplus labor thus appropriated no longer serves, quote, as a means for the full human development, quote, of a non-working elite. Rather, this elite acts merely as the character mask of a materially indifferent context of reproduction, one whose immanent telos is sociality devoid of any content, value. According to Marx, this is also reflected in the cultural level of the functioning capitalists. The very dependence of the worker's immediate physical existence upon the sale of his labor power, the fact of his, quote, derealization to the point of death by starvation, quote, in the event of his failure, constitutes a class-specific motive for rebellion. Heading 3. In explicit contrast to Meyer, Moll thus identifies in the early works an objectivist conception of revolution, one that synthesizes the theory of immiseration, worker exclusivism, and the philosophy of history. This model, he argues, constitutes a mere reduplication of the subject-object inversion, characteristic of capitalist relations of production. It manifests itself in the form of a paradox, that of a deterministic concept of emancipation, which continues to construe liberation as a coercive nexus, the unbinding of the subject as a form of its very subordination, the self-determination as a form of heteronomy, grasped conceptually. Quote, in this variant of revolutionary theory, the subsumption of the human being under social relations is not transcended, not even within the very conception of their revolutionary transformation. Quote, if revolutionary thought and action are, in the manner of the Hegelian, quote, cunning of reason, degraded to the status of mere heteronymous instruments for a, quote, self-critique, immiseration, collapse, revolution of the system, unquote, thereby positing society and history as a mystical subject, then theoretical critique, too, must be grounded in a theory of reflection. Within this framework, communism is already understood as, quote, the real movement which abolishes the present state of things, unquote, while its theoretical component is reduced to a mere retrospective reconstruction of a process that would unfold regardless of such theorizing. Precisely because theory becomes functionally superfluous to the emancipatory process itself, that is, because it is not conceived as an active, intervening mode of thought, one cannot, strictly speaking, speak of a spontaneous conception of revolution, for the actions of actual agents are deemed ontologically or historically predetermined. Consequently, their empirical class consciousness is required to conform to the standard of rationality, quote, imputed to them, a standard which theory has merely, quote, discovered. In contrast to such a, quote, modest assessment of intellectual capabilities, unquote, which Moll also identifies among proponents of the New Marx reading, such as Johann Bischoff, one finds in the early works, however, an alternative foundation for scientific socialism that moves beyond the intellectual abdication of theory in favor of an assumed ontological causality between impoverishment and revolution. Here, Moll essentially reflects Meyer's theses, albeit without addressing the latter's linkage of an idealist constitutive theory of social unfreedom with a practical concept of emancipation. This practical model is understood to encompass both the enlightenment of actors, viewed as a prerequisite for emancipatory action, and the prior existence of a struggling movement, antecedent to any theory, to which that theory may relate in an affirmative and enlightening manner. Scientific socialism, conceived as social critique, operates from a normative standpoint that precedes any concrete analysis, a standpoint that is subsequently refined and clarified in the course of the theory's further elaboration, ultimately adopting the mode of, quote, denunciation. According to Moll, theoretical critique is confined to a normatively guided analysis of the given reality. Quote, it formulates no instructions for action, unquote. Yet it remains directed toward an addressee who shares the critique of the object in question, albeit initially only in a, quote, naive sense, and is thereby, quote, moved to react against the content of the message in accordance with their own interest, unquote. In this way, the relevance of theory is safeguarded, as is the, quote, autonomy of revolutionary practice, unquote. Theory no longer claims to force this practice into the straitjacket of deductively anomalological explanations. Instead, it proceeds from the irreducibly practical necessity of revolutionary action itself, a necessity that exists without any theoretical guarantee. However, neither the standpoint of philosophy nor the motives of the actors are held to exist, quote, within a consciousness determined by social being, end quote. Rather, they are to be found exclusively within the subjects themselves, with their, quote, heads and hearts, end quote. It appears that Moll is here striving for a transcendental grounding of critique, one that constructs a dualism between will and world, and deems radical upheaval conceivable only insofar as it proceeds from Kant's concept of absolute freedom of the will. Yet one finds in Moll neither a conceptual differentiation between freedom of action and freedom of will, nor, for that matter, any reflection whatsoever on Marx's own concept of freedom. More problematic, however, is the fact that Moll, through her affirmative stance toward Marx's definition of scientific socialism, as the, quote, recognition of the social movement created by the people themselves, unquote, recklessly jeopardizes the autonomy of theoretical critique. While she does speak of a parallelism between the motives of theory and those of the combatants, a parallelism that supposedly leads to a, quote, identity between the, quote, philosopher and the revolutionary fighter, end quote, only through a process of mutual correction and cross-fertilization. Her almost compulsive urge to distance herself from avant-garde theories simply implies the naive presupposition that reality inherently strives toward the realm of thought in this manner. Theory, she insists, quote, must not presume to provide a concept isolated from the context of actual political struggles, end quote. But what if the, quote, actual struggles, invoked equally by Marx and Moll alike, do not exhibit any contents of consciousness capable of being taken up by radical critique or of being imminently, quote, reformed? What if, quote, reason has not, in fact, quote, always existed, end quote? And if the combatants do not simply need to be enlightened, regarding revolutionary goals that are already, albeit diffusely, factually present within them? Is the scientific character of scientific socialism to fall along with this subjectivist construction of immanent critique? If Moll credits a theory of practical emancipation with interpreting Marx's, quote, actual movement, not merely in terms of economic processes or autonomous developments of productive forces, but rather as a, quote, social movement, she nevertheless fails, just as Marx did, to escape the degradation of theory into a mere recording instrument for events, even if those events are understood as being driven by struggling subjects. For her, as a proponent of scientific socialism, a critic who is, quote, not one of us, end quote, is evidently just as inconceivable as a figure is for the communitarian. For her, as a proponent of scientific socialism, a critic who's, quote, not one of us, end quote, is evidently just as inconceivable as such a figure is for the communitarian Michael Walzer. It is precisely in this, quote, non-immanent direction that Marx's own thought increasingly moves in his later years. Thus, the question arises whether it is not, rather, a, quote, unconnected critique, one that deciphers the self-evident truths of modern ideals and legal concepts as specific to a particular social formation, constitutively interwoven with relations of work. Moll's lack of interest, particularly regarding Marx's theory of ideology, grounded as it is in a critique of political economy, is clearly demonstrated by her disregard for this specific aspect of Marxian theory. The stance is reflected in her thesis that Marx's critique of the utopian socialists was directed, quote, not against their goals, end quote, but exclusively against the doctrinaire character of their demands. A character Moll describes as being disconnected from practical social movements. One is left to wonder whether Moll has truly grasped the substance of Marx's critique of Bakunin's, quote, barracks communism, end quote, or of Proudhon's, quote, crude communism, end quote. That is, the latter's attempt to, quote, dissolve socialism into a fundamental misunderstanding regarding the necessary interconnection between commodities and money, end quote. The popular trope positing, quote, identical goals, yet, quote, divergent paths for anarchism and Marxian communism is simply incapable of capturing these substantive contradictions. According to Moll, the contradiction between Marx's two theories of revolution can now be explicated in terms of unmediated nature, and indeed the irreconcilability of these two approaches. The goal of the practical model of revolution, she argues, was formulated prior to any materialist analysis of the objective developmental tendencies and was never subsequently adjusted to align with such an analysis. Conversely, the designation of the proletariat as the exclusive revolutionary subject is situated, quote, beyond the logic of the practical model of emancipation, end quote. Given that the latter's universalist claim cannot be logically derived from the former, the grounds to be adduced in support of the revolution's universal character, Moll contends, cannot, precisely, be distilled from the specific lived context of the proletariat. Quote, suffering may merely provoke a striving for less suffering within the existing conditions. Injustice may give rise to a struggle for greater justice without necessarily seeking to overturn the existing order. Universal poverty and the total loss of that which constitutes human essence does not necessarily open the mind to a universal human principle, end quote. In this regard, Moll aligns herself with Meyer's critique, though she does not share his assessment of the, quote, speculative dialectic of revolution, quote, presented in The Holy Family. She interprets the thesis of a, quote, human nature, one supposedly rebelling within the proletariat against a dehumanized social environment, thereby furnishing the revolutionary impetus for the working class, not as a concept rationally explicable within the framework of a, quote, degradation theory, but rather as an anthropologistic subterfuge, designed to surreptitiously ascribe a revolutionary function to the proletariat. For according to the diagnosis Marx offers in his manuscripts, a human essence unaffected by alienation can no longer be said to exist, and yet this very essence is nonetheless expected to guarantee not only the experience of dehumanization itself, but also the indignation against it and the conscious awareness thereof. A line of argumentation grounded in the theory of immiseration, or to borrow Meyer's terminology, a quote, theory of deficiency posited as permanent, end quote, leaves, however, only one aspect of human deformation untouched: immediate material need, namely hunger, and from this sole remaining element it attempts to deduce objective, compelling imperatives for revolutionary action. Against this, it must ultimately be objected that the quote, total loss of human determinations precludes the development of a consciousness of this loss, and thus also the potential for the struggle for its recovery. End quote. 4. Moll, however, now observes that in his writings on the critique of political economy, Marx fundamentally criticizes the assumption of a quote, iron law of wages, end quote, a tendency toward absolute impoverishment, thereby depriving an objectivist theory of revolution of its very cornerstone. In contrast to the early demographic wage theory of classical economics, which attributed the reduction of wages to the subsistence minimum to the quote, generative behavior of the working class, end quote, Marx posits that fluctuations in wage levels are no longer a dependent variable of the size of the working population, but rather of the cyclical movement of accumulation. A quantitative increase in accumulation, assuming a constant division of reinvested surplus value into variable and constant capital, boosts the demand for labor power and, consequently, the wage level. This in turn reduces profits and therefore accumulation. Capital responds to this situation by increasing its organic composition through the intensified use of machinery, a move that lowers the demand for labor power, expands the industrial reserve army and the competition among workers, and ultimately drives wages down. Thus one can speak only of a relative overpopulation, relative, that is, to the conditions for the valorization of capital, and the cycles of demographic growth and economic dynamics are thereby exposed as incongruous and asynchronous. According to Marx, therefore, increasing participation of the working class in social wealth is not rendered quasi-physiologically impossible by immutable fluctuations in demographic growth. A theory of absolute immiseration is, in the context of the late works, not merely implausible, inasmuch as it would ultimately imply the complete annihilation of the working class, and thus of the value-creating element, but in the specific variant positing a perpetual decline of the price of labor power below its value, would also reduce the fundamental premises of value theory to absurdity. Rather, in the mature works, the physical subsistence minimum serves merely as the lower bound for the value of labor power, a value that is co-determined by the cultural level of a national economy and negotiated through industrial struggles between trade unions and capitalists. Furthermore, the quote, general law of capitalist accumulation, quote, discussed in chapter 23 of Marx's Capital, which diagnoses an expansion of the industrial reserve army alongside a rising organic composition of capital, i.e. the increasing displacement of labor power as the use of machinery grows, does not speak of absolute immiseration, but rather of a, quote, reduction of the historical and moral element in the value of the commodity labor power, end quote, brought about by intensifying competition among wage earners. However, this tendency is reversed during periods of expanded accumulation. It is noteworthy here that Moll neither takes into account the actual subject matter of this so-called, quote, general law, namely that it concerns primarily not the wage trends of the employed workforce, but rather the wretched living conditions of a supposedly expanding army of the unemployed, nor calls into question Marx's derivation of this tendency from the organic composition of capital. While in the book or pamphlet, Wage, Labor, and Capital, Marx merely posited a reduction in the value of labor power, this phenomenon is now systematically substantiated in Capital as the theory of the production of relative surplus value. The divergence in the value relation between wage, labor, and capital, rooted in the continuous decline in the value of labor power, driven primarily by advances in productivity, constitutes a tendency entirely independent of the real wage. What declines, therefore, in the context of the production of relative surplus value is the value share of variable capital relative to the surplus value produced. For a generalized increase in productive power, the value of the commodities required for the reproduction of labor power also falls, though not the quantity of use values that the worker is able to purchase with his wage. Quote, the value of the wage is to be estimated not by the quantity of means of subsistence the worker receives, but by the quantity of labor these means of subsistence cost, by the proportional share the worker receives of the total product, or rather of the total value of that product. It is possible that, when estimated in terms of use values, this wage may rise, and yet in terms of value it may fall, and vice versa. However, this value relation between variable capital and surplus value is not empirically transparent. Grasping it requires an enormous conceptual effort. In contrast, movements in the real wage, that is, the quantity of means of subsistence that can be acquired for a sum of money paid as the price of labor power, are perceived directly by the workers. Consequently, quote, relative immiseration, even while a rising standard of living remains simultaneously possible, need neither necessarily enter the workers' consciousness nor motivate them to engage in class struggle. As purely conceptual categories of the scientific observer, quote, relative immiseration and the, quote, decline in the value of labor power are thus rendered useless for the purposes of revolutionary theory. They could not replace the, quote, important indicative function, end quote, traditionally attributed to absolute impoverishment, namely that of rendering, quote, the fundamental relationship of exploitation immediately palpable to those involved, end quote. Karl Kautsky, by contrast, attempts, with the aid of a consumption-centered concept of relative immiseration, rooted in wage, labor, and capital, to substantiate the, quote, increase in the proletariat's dissatisfaction with its lot, end quote, and thereby the transcendent dimensions of class struggle. According to this view, the, quote, example of the exploiter's luxury, end quote, provokes a growing, quote, covetousness among the workers, which necessarily propels their struggle beyond a perspective of system-immanent reform, because the inequalities between the classes, regardless of the proletariat's specific material situation, could only be abolished under communism. In contrast to this, Moll argues, Marx's approach in Capital is to be understood not as a consumption-centered explanation of relative immiseration, but rather as an accumulation-centered theory of the production of relative surplus value. Quote, Marx's analysis of relative surplus value does not aim to provide a theory of the diverging purchasing power of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, okay, since surplus value, due to the imperatives of competition, must be primarily accumulated. That is, it must be utilized for the expanded reproduction of value. In summary, Moll concludes that although, quote, only the early writings address all the elements of the practical model of emancipation, while the later work confines itself to a critique of social relations, Marx's Capital is nevertheless to be interpreted more unequivocally than the early writings against the backdrop of a practical model of emancipation, end quote. Quote, for the theoretical framework underpinning the objectivist model of revolution, the theory of immiseration is to be found exclusively in the early writings, end quote. 2 years earlier, Wolf Wagner provided a further argument regarding the theoretical inadequacy, from a revolutionary perspective, of any diagnosis based on relative impoverishment. Drawing on historical empirical studies in the field of motivational research, he begins by arguing against the thesis that absolute impoverishment inevitably triggers revolutionary action in the long run. On the contrary, Wagner contends that the absolute deprivation among the affected social strata actually inhibits such action, owing to individual survival strategies and a progressive adaptation of the structure of needs to actual socioeconomic developments. Historically, revolutionary action can typically be shown to result from a, quote, discrepancy between expected and habitualized forms of need satisfaction on the one hand and actual satisfaction of needs on the other, end quote. This insight, which sheds light on the material aspects of a, quote, degradation theory that Meyer had previously overlooked, does not, however, constitute an argument in favor of the Kautskian or early Marxian variant of a causal link between relative impoverishment and revolution. For, as Wolf Wagner points out, that earlier approach involved a comparison, constructed by the theorists, between the lifestyles and purchasing power of two groups that were, in reality, entirely alien to one another, whereas, quote, relative deprivation, end quote, should instead be understood as a, quote, discrepancy between one's own habitualized and subjectively experienced expectations regarding needs, end quote, on the one hand, and the actual development of opportunities for satisfying those needs on the other. It is precisely at this juncture, that Thomas Zeidel's critique of Wagner comes into play. Within the context of advanced capitalist societies, he argues, the emergence of revolutionary action cannot be plausibly explained, not even by means of the quote, discrepancy theory, end quote. The experience of 20 years of social development in the Federal Republic, spanning the period following the publication of Wagner's book, has demonstrated that, in the wake of economic crises and the gradual dismantling of the welfare state, no, quote, anti-capitalist learning processes, end quote, were actually triggered among those who had previously enjoyed full employment. Instead, what actually took place was an adaptation to the neoliberal ideology of renunciation. This perspective, it is argued, entails, even among wage laborers, a, quote, instrumental view of society, end quote, that affirms the fundamental efficiency and prosperity-generating capacity of the capitalist economic system, in which, for the sake of the system's supposed restoration, it is prepared to accept even social cutbacks and widening inequality. The basis for this ideologism lies in the, quote, mystifications of commodities, wages, and capital, end quote, which, quote, already structure the processing of the experience of deprivation, with the result that the unequal distribution of total social product is perceived as a quasi-natural structural imperative, end quote. Wagner's approach quite simply offers no, quote, categorical means by which to render the critique of economic mystifications intelligible on the basis of the experience of discrepancy, end quote. Heading 5. Nevertheless, according to Moll, elements of an objectivist theory of revolution persist in Marx's later works. For instance, in the declamatory chapter 24.7 of the first volume of Capital, a chapter of such pivotal importance to traditional Marxism. Here, Moll identifies two possible, quote, Trinitarian formulas for such a model of emancipation. First, an argument rooted in collapse theory, encapsulating the thesis that the, quote, capitalist shell, end quote, of exclusive private property eventually becomes a fetter upon the universal socialized mode of production developing beneath it, and is therefore necessarily, quote, shattered. However, this argument, she notes, does not yet provide a rationale for the specific socialism-oriented action of a specific social group, namely the proletariat. Indeed, in the wake of a collapse scenario, understood in such purely negative terms, one could just as plausibly envision a new form of appropriation, mediated directly through violence at the hands of the ruling elite. The theory of collapse, therefore, implies nothing more than the general necessity of a transformation of the capitalist mode of production. The theory of immiseration, the diagnosis of a, quote, mass of misery, end quote, that supposedly provokes, quote, indignation against the system, constitutes the second moment of the revolutionary trinity and serves as the decisive link intended to lend plausibility to class-exclusive revolutionary action. However, the, quote, socialism thesis represents a theoretical innovation. Here the subjective role of the proletariat is finally and rigorously linked to the thesis of universality. The socialization of labor within capitalism manifested in the centralization of the means of production, a directly networked, rationalized, and quote, cooperative form of the labor process. The worldwide interdependence of economic actors, and much more, not only already dismantles, albeit, quote, in an antagonistic form, end quote, the particularisms of private property, market anarchy, and nation-statism, it also prefigures a socialist form of the future mode of production. This nexus between proletarian action and the objectively prefigured universalist form of appropriation can already be found in the German ideology. Quote, this appropriation must, therefore, from this side alone, possess a universal character corresponding to the productive forces and to the intercourse. All earlier revolutionary appropriations were restricted. Modern universal intercourse can be subsumed under individuals in no other way than by being subsumed under all individuals, end quote. Yet the socialism thesis alone can serve only as a, quote, argument of possibility, end quote, as it does not in itself exert any independent material compulsion toward revolutionary action. Alongside the objectivist formula for revolution, which at least with regard to the theory of immiseration, allegedly lacks any foundation in economic critique, Marx's Capital also permits a second formula, one that substitutes the, quote, despotism of the factory regime, end quote, described in detail, particularly in Chapter 13, for the concept of immiseration. Furthermore, the effects of the real subsumption of the labor process under capital, which Marx includes within his broader conception of, quote, misery, are said to constitute, quote, an integral part of the exclusively proletarian context of life, end quote. Yet they offer no argument for an inevitable uprising. This line of reasoning remains diffuse, however, because Moll fails to take into account the component of Marx's work pertaining to the theory of fetishism. The thesis advanced by her elsewhere, namely von Stein's contention that dependency is tolerable to most people, provided it is compensated for by material prosperity, sounds the most plausible of all. Despite these tendencies, it is argued, particularly with regards to Marx's Capital, that the work can only be meaningfully interpreted within the framework of a practical concept of emancipation. The sheer degree of complexity and scope of Marx's critique of political economy would have to be deemed nonsensical if one were to presuppose a revolutionary autodynamism that assigned no active, intervening role whatsoever to theory. Marx, however, proceeds from the premise that social actors can engage in emancipatory action, quote, only under the conditions of free will and clear consciousness, end quote, meaning that theory is indispensable, quote, for the constitution of such a conscious will, end quote. In terms of substance, Moll argues that precisely Marx's truly original scholarly achievement, the, quote, critical content of his analysis of forms, end quote, finds, quote, no place within an objectivist model of revolution, end quote. Thus, the analysis of an unconsciously constituted, reified nexus of social labor can itself be understood in terms of revolutionary theory, namely as the enlightenment of subjects regarding the causes of this system, and as the imparting of the, quote, insight that human beings can alter this practice, end quote. The critique of political economy thereby becomes an integral element of a theoretically mediated, practical movement aimed at the sublation of bourgeois society. Quote, involved in this movement, the critique simultaneously acknowledges the autonomy of, quote, its partner in practice, end quote, and participates in a process of mutual enlightenment and instruction, a dynamic that, it is argued, can be demonstrated through the shifts in Marx's more concrete revolutionary theoretical and political views. Moll's reference to Marx's self-assessment regarding his original insight in the field of the critique of political economy, though she herself does not explicitly note this, further supports her thesis concerning the removal of elements of the philosophy of history from his mature, form-analytical theoretical work. For instance, in a self-reflection on the innovations of his approach, contained in a letter to Joseph Weidemeyer, dated March 5, 1852, Marx still counts as his greatest achievements the historization of the concept of class, the, quote, proof of a necessary transition from class struggle to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the characterization of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a necessary transitional phase leading to a classless society. However, these statements by Marx, which contain central elements of a theory grounded in the philosophy of history, date from a period prior to the elaboration of his critique of political economy. Countering his early self-assessment, one can cite the arguments presented in his letters to Engels dated August 24, 1867, and January 8, 1868. In these letters, Marx identifies the derivation of profit and ground rent from surplus value, in the analysis of the dual character of labor, and the demonstration of the objective illusion inherent in the wage form of the central points of his work. Here, in his late work, which is allegedly so, quote, historicist in nature, not a trace remains of any elements of historical metaphysics. Finally, according to Moll, the validity of the practical model of emancipation remains unaffected even by the actual absence of a revolutionary proletarian subject, the only practical partner Marx supposedly envisioned during his lifetime. For, she argues, this model does not predetermine any specific social group as the transformative force. In his reconstruction, published 1 year after Moll's dissertation, of the, quote, implications for revolutionary theory of the critique of political economy, end quote, Rolf Peter Zieferle refines the thesis, quote, that Marx's theory of revolution is not a necessary internal result of his theory of bourgeois society, end quote. While Marx himself, in his search for imminent tendencies toward the dissolution of capitalism, did indeed fall prey to the self-misunderstanding that these, quote, movements of upheaval within the old society, end quote, could be rigorously derived in a scientific manner, it can be demonstrated that the main tendencies he posited, reflecting a, quote, objective logic of the completion of reflecting a, quote, objective logic of the completion of capital, end quote, specifically a diagnosis of immiseration, revived in complex form even in his later works, and the theorem of the law of the tangential fall in the rate of profit, fundamentally contradict the premises of his own value theory. It is not the historical materialist analysis of bourgeois society, but rather the, quote, philosophical historical classification of the capitalist present as a stage of self-perfecting alienation and negativity, end quote, undertaken under the influence of the Hegelian schema of the, quote, negation of the negation, end quote, that constitutes the source of Marx's objectivist theory of emancipation. This theoretical a priori decision, positing a developmental trajectory of the present that, quote, completes itself, end quote, within the negative and thereby, quote, flips over into revolution, not only led Marx to misjudge specific consequences of his approach regarding value theory, it also entailed a neglect of the, quote, eminent significance of the mystifications of consciousness, end quote, phenomena which, strictly speaking, ought to be derived as immediate results of his analysis of forms. Zieferle's work thus addresses a strand of Marx's critique of deterministic concepts of emancipation that is received scant attention in the reconstruction attempts examined thus far, e.g. Moll, or has even been explicitly excluded on strategic theoretical grounds, e.g. Meyer. 1. Quote, tendencies toward completion, quote, in the early works, new heading. Moll has already pointed out that in his Fichtian interpretation of the theory of alienation, found in the Paris manuscripts, Meyer downplays or entirely omits all elements of the philosophy of history present in that text. Zieferle, however, now identifies in this very context nothing less than the, quote, foundation of the, quote, fundamental philosophical historical schema, end quote, that would continue to guide Marx through his work right up to his late period. Here, Marx is practicing precisely what he had criticized in Hegel shortly before, the projection of the, quote, logic of the matter, end quote, onto reality, the subsumption of empirical reality under logical determinations, which are subsequently to be, quote, recognized everywhere, end quote, within the object itself, end quote. To, quote, be recognized everywhere, end quote, within the object itself. He even surpasses Hegel in this regard, for, unlike Hegel, he engages in the projection of a metaphysical historical schema onto the future. Marx examines private property through the lens of the philosophical historical question regarding its, quote, meaning in the development of humanity, end quote. Further, he praises Hegel's dialectic of the externalization and sublation of private property as, albeit in a mystified form, a representation of the historical act of human self-creation through labor. According to this view, human essential powers are developed in an antithetical manner. They must first be posited in an alienated form, one that has become autonomous vis-a-vis human beings and stands opposed to them as hostile, the particularity and constraints of private property, only to be subsequently reappropriated by them at the very zenith of alienation and subsumed under human needs. The university and freedom of communal property, realized on the basis of the results yielded by the development of private property. Consequently, for Marx, quote, communism constitutes the position as the negation of the negation, quote. That is to say, the restoration of the unity of man with man, and of man with nature on a higher plane. The process of emancipation from the state of private property, in this view, takes place through the mechanism of the completion and intensification of alienation, the opposition between alienated labor and capital, as that labor, in reified form, is such that, quote, this opposition, driven to its extreme, necessarily constitutes the culmination, the zenith, and the demise of the entire relationship, end quote. Marx, it is argued, quote, never abandoned this argumentative structure after 1844. A principle dominating the present must expand, reach its full realization, arrive at its internal terminus, and complete its negativity in order to reach the threshold of its sublation, beyond which it is positively sublated, end quote. According to Zieferle, Marx's interpretation of the Silesian Weavers' uprising in the critical marginal notes of 1844 led him to the later revised assessment that Germany had now caught up with the times, even at the level of social movements. Even more significant, however, was his view that the German proletariat was developing revolutionary theory ex nihilo from within itself. This in turn validated the objectivist, quote, postulate of immanence, end quote, found in the Paris manuscripts, and thereby effectively discarded critical philosophy, which had already become functionally obsolete within that earlier work as a constituent element of the emancipation process. In The Holy Family, this implication is explicitly articulated, and the thesis of universality advanced in the introduction is definitively fused with the speculative developmental schema of the manuscripts. The proletariat and the bourgeoisie thus constitute an intensifying antagonism situated within the broader context of human alienation that drives society toward revolutionary upheaval. By relocating the explosive potential of revolution to the process of the material realization and perfection of the world of private property, Marx effectively reduced the role of consciousness and cognition per se to that of a, quote, mere epiphenomenon of this negative process of completion, end quote. This dynamic, it is argued, delivers both the motivation for systemic critique and the requisite insight, quote, on a silver platter, end quote, without any reliance on theoretical sources drawn from the realm of bourgeois philosophy. Zieferle views the turn toward the objectively induced historical mission of the proletariat as an expression of Marx's, quote, disillusionment regarding the, quote, actual consciousness of the workers, end quote, a point substantiated by drastic Marx-founded letters dating from 1846 onwards. It remains unclear, however, whether this implies that merely the, quote, momentary illusions of empirical class consciousness, or indeed the consciousness of the workers per se, are to be regarded as irrelevant to the process of emancipation. According to Zieferle, the writings of the years 1846 to 49 see the concretization of Marx's objectivist conception of emancipation, an emancipation that is, quote, itself still defined as a moment within the natural nexus of the alienated world, end quote, and is described by means of a, quote, positive science of the self-dissolution of bourgeois society, end quote. Here Marx conceives of the mediating step between the social situation and the historical mission of the proletariat as a development from a, quote, class in itself, i.e. from a latent complex of characteristics shared by individual non-owners of the means of production, to a, quote, class for itself, end quote, i.e. to a collective actor conscious of its identity, its conflicts, and its revolutionary potential. While initially there exists only the competition of isolated workers vying for success in selling their labor power, they gradually join forces for the purpose of their basic self-preservation, specifically the, quote, assertion of their wages, end quote, which, while not necessarily exceeding the absolute subsistence minimum, may well fall below it, as well as for the reduction of working hours, forming coalitions that are initially workplace-based, then local, sectoral, national, and finally international in scope, and which ultimately struggle for political power. This unification of the workers is not only brought about by the ruthless valorization interests of capital, it is also fostered by the development, driven by capital itself, of internal communication structures, the mass-scale combination of labor forces within the workplace and residential areas, and industrial means of communication, ranging from the railway and the press to the telegraph. Thus, for Marx, associations are not to be regarded as merely the system-immanent reform of the workers' economic situation, a possibility that, in accordance with his premises rooted in classical political economy, is in fact ruled out, but rather as schools for the transcendence of the system itself. According to the early Marx, the fundamental causes driving the proletariat toward revolution are, on the one hand, the reality of an absolute subsistence minimum serving as the upper limit for wages, indeed an absolute pauperization and, quote, dehumanization extending even beyond this limit, which is accompanied by a homogenization of proletarian living conditions and an increasing polarization of social classes, and on the other the concomitant demystifications of bourgeois ideals and ideologies. As a result, workers are compelled to, quote, view their life position and their mutual relations with sober eyes, end quote. The exploitative nature of the capitalist production process lies openly exposed before them, and they come to regard, quote, law, morality, and religion, end quote, as mere, quote, bourgeois prejudices, end quote, quote, behind which are just as many bourgeois interests, quote, behind which just as many bourgeois interests lie concealed, end quote. Quote, the, quote, essence of this society, end quote, Zieferle summarizes, quote, appears directly as such, end quote. According to Marx, the speculative dialectic of revolution resides in the fact that bourgeois society, through its own development, generates its, quote, its own gravedigger, end quote. a figure whose victory, the revolutionary transformation of the mode of social organization, mediated by the seizure of political power, is rendered, quote, inevitable and historically guaranteed by the dynamics outlined above. For the issue at hand is, quote, not what this or that proletarian, or even the entire proletariat, may momentarily envision as its goal. The issue is what it is, and what, in accordance with this being, it will historically be compelled to do, end quote. For Marx, however, the revolution implied, alongside the full maturation of class antagonism, the development of the productive forces. Ultimately was conceivable only as a world revolution, as the simultaneous action of actors who had already been socio-structurally synchronized and deterritorialized by the capitalist world market, and who had been stripped of their national and regional particularisms. Marx's insistence on the objective preconditions for a socialist upheaval, combined with a unilinearly reductive perspective on the development of social formations, which entailed the universalization of the European developmental model, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, led him to a problematic understanding of historical simultaneity, and even to a partial apologia for the supposedly unconscious modernizing effects of colonialism. This perspective, moreover, categorically ruled out any, quote, independent non-capitalist path of emancipation, end quote. According to Zieferle, Marx likewise situates both free trade and the struggle for the 10 Hours Bill within this model of simplification and polarization. Proceeding from this premise, he welcomes any acceleration of the social revolution brought about by an intensification of social antagonisms. The theoretical model of revolution outlined here thus posits, in essence, immiseration, disenchantment, total dehumanization, the universality of the mode of production, the providential nature of the historical task, and unilinear evolution as the necessary and sufficient conditions for the formation of revolutionary subjectivity and for the successful overthrow of the capitalist mode of production. The proletariat emerges as a propertyless, systematically hopeless, nationless, and illusionless subject, and is thus, quote, nothing to lose but its chains, end quote. New heading 2. Tendencies toward completion in the late work. Like Moll, Zieferle aims, quote, with Marx against Marx, end quote, to assert Marx's critique of political economy against his philosophy of history. Unlike Moll, however, Zieferle identifies, even within the late work, so-called, quote, tendencies toward completion, end quote, as positions rooted in the philosophy of history that merely clothe themselves in the form of arguments critical of political economy. Accordingly, the critique of political economy can be reconstructed, in a figurative sense as it were, quote, against the backdrop of the schema of alienation/externalization and the tendency toward the completion of the system of abstract labor right up to the threshold where its sublation occurs as the negation of the negation, end quote. Zieferle, however, takes this program very seriously. Indeed, his very characterization of use value as the, quote, anticipation of realized species being, end quote, constitutes a historico-philosophical interpretation of this category, one for which no basis whatsoever can be found in Marx, which is why any textual citation is consistently omitted. Accordingly, for Zieferle, socialization mediated by value represents alienation in its perfected form, universality in a negative guise, since the social whole is now integrated and dominated unconsciously, quote, from a single abstract center, end quote. The reconstruction of this negative form of socialization as a, quote, self-perfecting world of objectivity, end quote, arises from the identical formal principle of value, is in this view the central task of Marx's critique of political economy. This exposition, however, is said to possess a, quote, double significance, end quote. First, it aims at the deciphering dissolution of the, quote, putative natural nexus into history, end quote. That is, the destruction of the fetishistic illusion that the form of capitalist socialization constitutes the natural form of human production. Furthermore, however, Marx is seen as simultaneously searching for tendencies toward the system's objective self-dissolution, in accordance with the well-known Hegelian schema, Here it is not its, quote, its worthiness of critique when measured against the standard of autonomy, end quote, but rather, quote, its objective completion, its sublation within the very confines of its own identity, end quote. That is explicated as the proof of its transitory character. Initially, three factors are cited which, in Zieferle's view, Marx situates within the framework of a deterministic, quote, logic of completion, quote. 1. The reversal of the law of appropriation. 2. The development of the productive forces and their organizational forms. 3. The tendential fall in the rate of profit. I don't really know how this translates as, but it says like Ray 1, which this looks like a I guess this is referring to the reversal of the law of appropriation. I don't know. Anyway, Ray 1. This first aspect in particular demonstrates that Zieferle, despite professing adherence to a, quote, logical reading, interprets the mode of presentation in Marx's Capital in terms of a history of decline, effectively passing this position off as Marx's own. Footnote 180.
Consequently,
Here
the development
even
of value
finds the
forms,
methodological
culminating
overtones
in
that
money,
interpret the analysis
appears
of
to
the
him as a,
formal
quote,
determination
history of perfection
of simple circulation and
regarding
its
the
agents
system of
as a,
wealth
quote,
forms
theoretical fiction.
within the paradigm of, quote, completion.
Regarding the, quote,
This is
relations
synonymous
of
with the
simplest
attainment of
commodity
a
production,
system's
quote.
inherent limits. In doing so, Zieferle unerringly seizes upon Marx's historicizing formulations
ideal-typical construction
found in
of
the
a
first
society of
chapter
small commodity producers,
regarding the existence of the
abstract
simple
labor
and
is the
expanded
center of
value
social
forms.
synthesis,
He then
without,
presents
however,
a
touching the labor
superficial
process
account of the
itself,
transition to
end quote.
capital, one that leaves obscure the fact
And that's
that this
from,
transition constitutes a
Zieferle.
purely conceptual operation. The actual motif of, quote, completion,
Footnote
however,
184.
is introduced,
Mega,
according to
quote,
Zieferle,
that exchange
with the
value, or more
reversal
precisely,
of
the
the law of
monetary system,
appropriation.
is indeed
It
the
is
system
here
of freedom and
where labor
equality,
power is exchanged for
and that
capital as
whatever
surplus
stands in
value,
their way as a
and thus
disturbance
for the result
during
of
the
labor
further
appropriated
development of
without
the system
compensation
constitutes
during the production
disturbances imminent
process,
to it.
that it becomes
Specifically,
evident
the
that
very
the, quote,
realization
principle of equivalence,
equality and freedom, which reveal
is itself
themselves
the
as
engine of its own
inequality and
dissolution,
unfreedom.
end quote. This conceptual analysis of the
Zieferle.
internal nexus between the principle of equivalence and the exploitative relationship, Zieferle argues, establishes the basis for two distinct categories of critique. The first strategy demonstrates, through an eminently logical
Quote, the
unfolding
determination of
of the
simple
categories of
circulation,
political economy,
quote, the
that the
determination
promise
of simple
attached to these
circulation
categories
are in any
a
case
promise
of no
grounded in the
significance for the
determinations of
society
simple
of the third
circulation,
stage. The breach
freedom,
of the
equality,
principle of equivalence as the imminent further development of the
property, and
value
bentham,
form holds
namely
a
the
progressive
promise
significance,
of a, quote, true
given
Eden
that
of
the
the innate
capitalist
rights of
social
man,
form
end quote,
constitutes
is from
the
a
immediate
societal
prelude to the
perspective nothing but
emancipated
pure
society.
illusion.
End quote.
It proves, in other words, that, quote, commodity society cannot
Zieferle.
fulfill its own foundational promise, end quote. Consequently, this also precludes any attempt to realize these promises in their current
Footnote
form,
198.
given that
Quote,
the actual
riddle,
determinations
that the
governing
capitalist, who is
circulation,
concerned solely with
much
the
like the
production of
ideals they
exchange
generate,
value,
are
constantly
inextricably
strives to
bound
lower the
up
exchange
with their very
value
antithesis,
of commodities and
to make the forms of
is
the law of
resolved.
appropriation of
While
commodity
in the
exchange,
Grundrisse,
which in
Marx still
themselves already
characterizes this
constitute
fact
forms
as a
of
quote,
alienation,
processual
and
contradiction,
are ultimately dialectically
one through
intertwined,
which
more
quote,
complex
production
forms of
resting on
heteronomy
exchange
and
value
inequality.
collapses. End quote.
Quote, the
He
standard for a
subsequently
critique
demonstrates it to be
cannot have been Marx's
an imminent
intention,
tendency of the capitalist mode of production through the theory of the production of relative surplus value.
through suggestive
This
circumlocutions
theory is
regarding the
accompanied by the
dialectical
insight that the
relationship
capitalist is not
of
concerned
implication
with the
between the
magnitude of value of
determinations of
commodities,
circulation
but rather with the
and of
surplus value objectified within them,
reproduction,
and ultimately with the rate of
reproduction
profit.
within the
See on this
capitalist
point
economy,
above all, Heinrich,
phrased
1999.
as the, quote, sublation or, quote,
Footnote
breaching
202.
of the principle
As
of
early as
equivalence.
1973, Flatov
Zieferle
and
now
Pliskin
prepares
refuted
the
this
ground
interpretation
for a
of the
thesis
quote,
concerning a
road
second,
building section end quote,
supposedly
of the
Marxian
Grundrisse,
argumentative strategy,
demonstrating that it is
namely that
suitable
the,
neither
quote,
as a general
reversal
theory of
of the law of
universal material
appropriation is
conditions
thereby,
of
quote,
production,
itself
nor
once
for a
again
phase
situated
theoretical or
within the
evolutionist
historico-philosophical
interpretation.
schema of direct negation, end quote. inasmuch as
Footnote
Marx
206.
allegedly assumes, quote, that
Meinhard
developed
Kreit
value abstraction
has
contradicts the very core of its
subjected this topos,
the very concept of its core form,
of, quote,
unquote.
negative
However,
sublation,
according
as found
to
in
Marx's
Marx and in
actual
the, quote,
exposition,
market socialist,
the contradiction to the principle of equivalence exists in reality
Johann
only with
Bischoff and his
respect to the
associates who draw
content
upon it
of the exchange relation,
to a
specifically
plausible
the
critique.
consumption of the exchange
Only
commodity,
insofar as the identity
a matter
of owner
with
and
which the
functioning
laws of
capitalists were
exchange are
counted among
entirely
the general
unconcerned.
formal determinations
Even
of
if, quote,
capitalism,
consumption here
could the joint
stands
stock
as a
company be
synonym for the
regarded
specifically
as
capitalist
the
relation
form of its
of
dissolution?
disappropriation of
According to
surplus
Kreit,
labor.
however,
Thus,
joint
the
stock
rhetoric of,
companies,
quote, breaching
the credit system,
the principle
and
of
comparable
equivalence is more
phenomena
than merely
can,
misleading.
within the framework
Rather, it
of
serves to
Marxian
bolster
theory,
Z.
only be
Fairless
understood as
assertion of a
phenomena that
historico-metaphysical
transcend the
term
limitations
in the
of
motif
individual
of, quote,
capitals.
reversal,
They by no
an
means
assertion that
burst
can
the
only
boundaries
be
of the capitalist
characterized
formal
as a
determination of
projection on
production,
the part of the
since they
author.
generate clearly functional
Consequently, this,
effects
quote, reversal
for the developed
is held to mark the
valorization
sublation of
process.
value, quote, from within itself.
In the,
unquote.
quote,
The
sublation
fact that the
argument,
principle of
unquote,
exchange
by
has reached its,
contrast,
quote,
quote, the
internal
contradiction
end, unquote,
that the
and
autonomy
that the,
of
quote,
capitalists
actual
requires
history of
forms of
value has been
association
completed, unquote.
becomes an
Its
opposition.
alleged, quote, breaching
this
even
opposition,
mutates into
one
a
side,
prefiguration of
that
its
of
own
association,
emancipatory abolition,
appears as the overcoming of
albeit
the
in
other
an
side.
antithetical form,
In doing so,
one still bound
one
up with
blissfully
relations of
abstracts from the
domination,
specific character of
given
the
that under
association,
communism as well,
which in fact
human
remains tethered to
emancipation
the
is
very
understood
opposite
to go
of
hand in hand
association,
with the
competition and
sublation of the logic of
self-referential
exchange.
valorization of capital. End quote.
Yet, there is not a single textual shred of evidence to support
Right.
the notion that Marx viewed gratuitous appropriation as a quote, breaching of the principle of exchange.
Footnote
that
209.
B,
Marx does not
thereby
claim to, quote,
prepares the forms of social
investigate a
intercourse
dynamic
characteristic
equilibrium
of an
of a
emancipated
series
society.
of intersecting factors.
Moreover,
Rather, in the
uncompensated
case of the profit
appropriation
rate,
is a
he
hallmark of all
ultimately sees the
stratified social
guarantor of the
formations
collapse
to date.
of capitalism.
A fact
End
that, for
quote.
instance, might even
Zieferle.
allow even the relationship of serfdom to be interpreted as a prefiguration of liberation. At
Footnote
this juncture,
214.
therefore, the application
quote,
of the schema
this
involving
peculiar
the, quote,
barrier
shedding of
testifies
the
to the
antagonistic
limitedness and
shell,
merely
unquote,
historical
and the,
transitory
quote,
character of the
liberation of the
capitalist mode of
content,
production.
unquote, is strictly
Mega.
Zieferle's own construct.
Quote,
Is
transitory
a construct,
and quote,
admittedly,
capitalist inserted
that is
by
stretched
Engels.
even further by being employed to derive the, quote, general determination, quote,
Cited in
of the
Zieferle in
proletariat
1979.
as the, quote, subject
Quote,
of the positive sublation of
not
capital,
its,
unquote,
not its susceptibility
on
to
the grounds
criticism
that within the
measured against the
relationship
standard of
between
autonomy,
capital and labor power,
rather its objective
exchange alone
completion,
yields
its
exploitation
sublation
as its
while
consequence,
still within its own
and
identity
that consequently the,
offers
quote,
the guarantee
sublation of
that
the
it is
principle
not
of
the
equivalence
natural form of
within
human
the
life in
principle
general.
of equivalence, end quote,
Zieferle.
positions the working class, quote, at the threshold of a system,
Footnote
and thus
217.
in tendency
Michael
already in
Heinrich
its
has pointed
beyond,
out
end
that the
quote.
very concept of a rising technical composition is problematic, since heterogeneous quantities of use values cannot be brought into a ratio
Ray 2,
either among themselves or with heterogeneous quantities of concrete labor.
which refers to
Zieferle's
the
terminology,
development
by
of the productive
contrast, is
forces
quite
and the
diffuse,
organizational
e.g. when he
forms,
speaks
I
of the,
think.
quote, organic value composition, end quote. Zieferle. This expression is nonsensical,
true
since according to
sublation,
Marx,
however,
the organic
requires,
composition
alongside the
designates
development of the
precisely the
productive
value
forces,
composition
further
as
tendencies toward
determined by the
polarization
technical
and
composition.
perfection. Thus, the, quote, perfection of form, end quote, must be accompanied
Footnote
by a, quote,
221.
perfection of the
However, it was
development
Michael
of
Heinrich
productive
who, in his
potentials,
detailed
end quote.
discussion of the law
According
and
to Marx, this
attempts to
formation of the
salvage it,
material basis
first
of
provided a
communism
sufficient foundation
must necessarily
for this
pass
thesis.
through the authoritarian
Quote, we find two
organizational
variable
form
quantities,
of capitalist,
the
quote,
long-term
production for
direction
the
of
sake
movement of
production,
which is
quote.
known.
Since
However,
it is here
the
for the
direction
first
of
time
movement of the rate of
the
profit
competition-driven
depends
compulsion
on
to
the relative
capitalize
movement
surplus
of
product
these two quantities.
in the guise of progressively
On the
perfected
relative
means of
movement of these two
production
quantities.
prevails.
Yet such a
This
comparison
ensures that
cannot
the
be made at all
expropriation
using merely
expropriated portion of
qualitative
labor is absorbed
merely
neither in the
qualitative
immediate
information,
consumption of the workers
information that
nor
relies
to the
solely
luxury consumption of a
that
non-working
relates solely
elite.
to the direction of
This creates
movement
the conditions
of
for a
the
retreat
quantities being compared in code.
of the, quote, realm of necessity.
At the same
through the
time,
potential
Heinrich
creation
demonstrates
of
that
freely
dispensing with the
disposable
law
time,
has absolutely no
as well as
impact
for
on
a
Marx's
more
crisis
humane
theory.
structuring of the production process. In this context, the motif of transitory necessity of an inevitable development
Footnote 224.
taking a, quote,
See Holt's
antagonistic form,
1993. Quote,
as a
the
process,
claim that
quote,
class
in which
position
individuals are
offers
sacrificed,
protection
end quote,
against
is
this,
indeed clearly
bracket,
discernible.
against ideological
Yet,
consciousness,
according
end bracket,
to
was asserted by
Zieferle,
Marx himself,
quote,
primarily in
real
political
subsumption,
rather than
quote,
theoretical
is
writings.
also
End
integrated into the historico-philosophical
Holtz.
schema. It leads to the, quote,
Footnote
abstractification,
225.
quote, i.e. the
Zieferle,
de-skilling,
1979,
standardization,
quote,
and material
relevant experiences
indifferentiation
must first be undergone
of concrete
experiences
labor,
against which the
thereby
explanatory power of
foreshadowing the
mystification
sublation of the
can no
division
longer
of
hold
labor
up.
into in
Before
an antagonistic
individuals
form.
will of their own accord
Finally,
arrive
according
at a
to
point
Marx,
where they
it is
feel
a
a need for the
systematic tendency
enlightenment that
to
critical
increasingly
science is able
replace
to
the
provide.
expenditure of concrete labor
Zieferle.
time with the application of science, quote, general
Footnote
labor,
229.
and
More
machinery.
precisely formulated, the
This gives
capitalist
rise to an
appropriation
imminent contradiction
capitalist appropriates
with the
all
specific
products of
form
labor
of wealth
and
characteristic of the
legitimately
capitalist
remunerates
mode of
only a
production,
portion of their value,
a form based solely
specifically
on the,
that
quote,
portion
measurement
which constitutes
of
the
quanta
value
of labor
power.
time, as, quote, social potentials lying beyond the reach,
Footnote
quote,
232.
of, quote, capitalist
From this
industry,
arises the,
quote,
quote, rational
science and
expression,
technology
quote,
have, in this
quote,
sense,
value
already
of
outgrown
labor,
the value form of the
quote,
mode
which
of
derives the
representing wealth.
representatives
Here,
which
too,
derives the representatives of
Zieferle
classical
offers
economics
no
and the
indication
theoretical
of Marx's
foundational
insight,
aporias.
which becomes evident in Capital, in contrast to the Grundrisse, that the social character of productive forces must be viewed as positive by Capital.
Irrational?
Nor does he acknowledge that far from constituting a glaring contradiction, the mechanization of the production process and the value form
Footnote
are,
239.
in fact,
In the
system
unconceptual
compatible and
transition
inextricably
of the
linked
political
with the
economic
process of producing relative
determination of
surplus
capital,
value.
from a concept of quantities of goods,
In the
capital
Grundrisse,
is a
however,
simple means of
Marx
production,
still argues as
to
follows,
a balance sheet
quote,
concept.
as soon as
Capital
labor
is
in its
simple money,
immediate form
which is
has
itself
ceased to
merely an
be
isolation,
the great source of wealth,
absolutization,
labor
and
time ceases
autonomization
and
of
must cease
specific
to be
partial
its
moments
measure,
of the
end quote.
capitalist process, commodity and money, vis-a-vis one
With
another.
this, the,
The
quote,
illusion of the
objective limit
unmediated
of capital is
self-positing of
reached,
value
end quote.
is taken
And
to such an
capital now
extreme
becomes a,
that
quote,
one is
fetter
forced to posit
upon the
a, quote,
development of the
occult
productive forces.
quality bracket of
Yet
the
what
same in bracket
Zieferle means
to
by
be
a, quote,
unequal to
reasonable
itself,
relationship,
end
end quote, between
where 4
expended labor
equals
time
5,
and the
quote.
use value of the product remains
Mega.
just as obscure as the thesis that, under highly technologized production conditions, value determination and material wealth become, quote, increasingly incommensurable, end quote. Given that in Marx's framework, any commensurability between value and use value
Footnote
is by
244.
definition
Marx
ruled
was
out.
already aware of this in 1847, though without, however,
According to
drawing any
Zieferle,
consequences
Marx
for
identified
revolutionary
tendencies
theory
toward
from it.
perfection,
Quote, as
even with
long as the
regard to the
wage
provision of general
labor
conditions
is
of
a wage
production,
labor,
such
his
as
lot depends
transport
on capital.
infrastructure.
That is the much
At
vaunted
the highest
community
stage
of
of
interest
capitalist
between
development,
worker and
this provision
capitalist.
is undertaken by capital itself.
The consequences of the
thereby being
interest shared
taken
by
out of
all
the hands
owners
of
of
the
revenue
state.
sources is the
It is
reproduction
only
of
at this point
capitalist
that
relations
capital
of
has supposedly,
production.
quote,
Quote,
become the
securing
all-dominating
ownership
principle
of
of society,
the, quote, revenue source,
It would
labor,
appear that
end quote,
Marx, much as
actually
he
means
does
securing
regarding
one's
the relationship
own
between centralizing
non-ownership,
and decentralizing
an interest in a
tendencies,
continuous flow of
assumes a
revenue
linear
means
trajectory of
that
development here,
nothing other than
one that
securing
cannot
the
be reversed by
precondition for a
countervailing
smooth process
forces.
of capital valorization.
However,
end
for
quote.
Marx, it is specifically joint stock
However,
companies and
Flatov and
producers'
Huisken
cooperatives
juxtapose the
that constitute
self-interpretation
the,
of the
quote,
owners of
abolition
labor
of the
power
capitalist mode of
as
production
owners
within
of
the
revenue
capitalist mode of
sources,
production
and
itself,
their
end quote,
self-interpretation as
the, quote,
class
most perfected
individuals in
form,
an unmediated fashion.
verging on communism, end quote.
Footnote
Joint stock companies
245.
represent, quote,
In doing so,
socialized
Zieferle
capital
draws upon
deployed
the
for the purpose of
Marxist
executing
group of
capital-intensive
Marxist group.
investments,
Neither
thereby
the Marxist
affecting
group
the
nor
separation of
Flatov Huisken,
ownership from
however,
managerial
draw
control.
any consequences for
Quote,
revolutionary
in the
theory
joint
from
stock
this.
company,
Thus, in the work of Flatov and Huisken,
the development of the
despite their own
productive
critique of
forces
the,
in
quote,
their capitalist
naive
guise,
derivation, end quote,
reaches its
of
ultimate
revolutionary
organizational
class
form.
consciousness on the part of the PKA,
Here, the social character of
they nevertheless
production
once
bursts
again,
through
without
the shell of private
justification,
property,
introduced the, quote,
without, however, actually
system-shattering
calling that
action,
private
end
property
quote,
into question.
of the working class, asserting that their, quote,
This holds
always
true, too, in
resides
the
within
case
it,
of producers'
quite
cooperatives.
independently of its
While the
consciousness,
separation between
the
immediate
germ of a
producers and the
transitory
means of
movement,
production
end
is
quote.
indeed eliminated.
Flatov and Huisken.
The separation between individual enterprises
Footnote
conceived as
246,
autonomous private
or as
production
Zeidel,
units remains a fundamental
1996,
premise.
observes, quote, as
Consequently,
long as
quote,
social
the
productive
workers
forces
acting
remain
as
the
an
productive
association
forces of
become their own
capital,
capitalists.
just so long
That is,
does
they
the
are
fact that
compelled
the
to utilize the
female
means of
workers
production
receive only a
for the
fraction of
purpose
the
of
value
valorizing
produced,
their own labor, end quote.
of the value product they produce,
Thus, the relationship
remain a
between
necessary
labor and ownership
precondition
has, in this
for the
context,
reproduction of social wealth,
manifesting once
and
in
by
a negative
extension a
form and once in a
precondition
positive
of their
form,
own share in it,
reached its,
the,
quote,
quote,
culmination
instrumental
point, end
social
quote.
consciousness, end quote.
Yet this objective
Namely, the
autonomous
belief that female
dynamic,
workers can only
driven by
fare
the
well if
competitive
capital itself
development of
fares well,
productive forces,
parenthesis,
propels the
i.e.,
system mainly
if
to
it
the
is
very
able to
threshold of the
accumulate
capitalist
effectively,
mode of
end
production,
parenthesis, reflects
cannot,
the state
however,
of
shatter
affairs
that mode
bracket in a
itself,
distorted
and
manner,
is therefore
end bracket.
ultimately contingent
quote.
upon the, quote, self-conscious action of the
Zeidel,
proletariat.
1996. Ray 3. which refers to, let me go back. The tendential fall in the rate of profit.
Footnote 252, quote, the struggle over the legal limitation of working hours, this is from Mega. Quote,
Above all, however,
struggle over
the law
legal
of the tendential
limitation
fall
of
in the
working
rate of
hours
profit
raged
is
all the more
intended to
fiercely the more
substantiate
it,
the idea of
aside
an
from
imminent
startled
limit
greed,
to the valorization
in fact
process.
struck at the great issue
in the first
dispute,
volume of Marx's
the issue
Capital,
between the blind
Marx
rule of the laws
extrapolates
of
two
supply and
developmental
demand,
tendencies
which
within the
constitute the
capitalist
political
economy.
economy of the middle
On the
class,
one hand, the tendency
and the
toward
control
the
of social
production
production by
surplus
social
value,
insight and foresight,
which leads to a
which constitutes
systematic
the political
increase in the
economy
rate
of the working
surplus
class.
value.
The 10 Hours Bill was therefore not merely a great political achievement. It was the victory of a
Money prime
principle.
equals
For the
money
first
divided
time,
by
the political
variable
economy of the middle class succumbed in broad daylight before the political economy of the working class. End quote.
On the other
Z.
hand, the rising value composition of capital, constant to variable capital, induced by this very same process, that is, the systematic growth of the share of value invested in constant capital, means
Footnote
a production
262.
relative to that invested in
For
variable
according to
capital and labor
Marx,
power.
increasing employment
The
relative
combination
to
of
a
these
given amount
tendencies
of variable
affecting
capital
the
is
third volume
supposed to
of
imply
Marx's
this,
Capital
whatever this
now
is.
leads Marx to
If
posit
the
the
variable
law of the
component of
tendential fall
capital
in the rate of
rises
profit.
with the nominal wage, the real wage as well, this would reduce the share of the surplus value expended on constant capital. However, this is precluded by Marx's thesis regarding the correlation between a rising technical composition and a rising value composition.
According to Zieferle, the expanded circuit of capital thus constitutes in the long run a self-destructive process based on the paradoxical effects that the measures taken to increase the rate of exploitation, productivity gains through the use of machinery, withdraw ever larger portions of the total invested capital from the
Footnote
process of
264,
valorization.
regarding the critique of the quote,
Consequently,
general
quote,
law of
profit
capitalist
as
accumulation,
the essential
quote,
motive for
see
production
also
under
Heinrich
capitalist
1999
conditions
and
becomes
Elmer's
ever smaller
2007.
in proportion to the capital employed. End quote.
And there's a quote
Well,
from
Marx
Mega,
does indeed
quote,
cite a number of
consequently,
quote,
it's
counter
the general
tendencies,
tendency
end
of
quote,
capitalist production
temporarily
not to
counteract
raise
the
the
fall in the
average
rate of
wage
profit.
standard, but to
He
lower
ultimately
it,
regards
or to
this
depress
fall as
the
an
value
imminent
of
and
labor
objective
more or
systemic
less to
limit,
its minimum limit. End
one that
quote.
offers a quote guarantee that quote the epoch of capitalist production will, in accordance with its own inner logic,
Marx,
come to an end.
cited in Zieferle 1979,
Quote, the true barrier to capitalist
telling that
production is
Zieferle
capital itself. End quote.
cites no evidence for
He
this
even links
thesis
the
from
demonstration
Marx's
of the
Capital.
transitory nature of capitalism
For nowhere
rather than to the
therein
analysis
is
of
there to be
forms,
found any statement regarding, quote, a greater or lesser
as in
quantity
the
of
first volume
consumer
of
goods
Capital,
available
to
to
this law
working
of
class
collapse.
households, end quote. Heinrich.
Zieferle now explicitly draws
1999.
attention to the most important prerequisite, the very
Footnote
premise
267,
intended to
as suggested in
substantiate the
Marx's
long-term fall in
formulation,
the rate of
quote,
profit.
it follows therefore
Namely, the
that as
thesis of the
capital
organic
accumulates,
composition of
the situation
capital
of the worker,
rises
whatever his
faster than the rate
remuneration,
of
high or
surplus
low, must
value.
deteriorate, end
He
quote.
writes, quote, it would therefore
Marx.
have to be demonstrable
Footnote
within
268,
the framework
quote,
of value
the recognition of the
determination
products
that
as
money
his own
prime
and the
cannot
judgment of the separation from the conditions of his realization as an improper coercive one is an enormous consciousness. It is itself the product of the mode of production resting on capital, and is just as much the knell to its doom as with the slave's consciousness that he cannot be the property of a
it would
third
not
party.
therefore have to be
With
demonstrable
his consciousness
in
as
the
a
framework
person,
of value
slavery
determination
merely vegetates
that
on as an artificial existence and
money
has ceased to be
prime
able to endure as a
cannot, in the
basis of
long run,
production. End quote.
increase
Marx.
to such an extent as to compensate for the fall in the rate of profit.
And that's the end of the footnotes to Chapter 3,
triggered by
Part
the
3
rise
of
in
Ingo Elbef's
constant
Marx in the
capital.
West. Part 3 of the book
I don't know if
is titled
prime is
Christ
actually
is a
what I'm supposed to be
Revolutionary
saying here.
Theory.
Seems like what he's saying
Chapter
is
3 is titled Critique of Political Economy versus
Surplus
Objectivist
value.
Model of Revolution. Thank you so much for listening.
I'm gonna guess this what is meant by this M prime that's here. He writes, quote, it would therefore have to be demonstrable that in the framework of value determination that surplus value, the rate of surplus value, cannot, in the long run, increase to such an extent as to compensate for the fall in the rate of profit triggered by the rise in constant capital. End quote. However, Marx allegedly contrived such a proof merely by directly linking technologically driven increases in productivity to a rise in the value composition of capital. Yet, Zieferle argues, this connection lacks plausibility
for one cannot assume that an increase in material productivity will necessarily produce a proportional effect on the value composition, nor can value theory, strictly speaking, yield any definitive statement regarding the relationship between the two. Quote, since technological processes are at play here, end quote. Furthermore, in this context, Marx allegedly, quote, fails to take into account the devaluation of the elements of constant capital, end quote, even though he acknowledges and discusses this phenomenon elsewhere. In light of this fundamental objection, one could establish, quote, only a conditional relationship, end quote, between a rising value composition and a growing rate of surplus value, the latter being driven by an increase in productive forces. The rate of profit then would fall only in those instances where the process of accumulation, according amidst rising productivity, is not offset by a corresponding devaluation of both labor power and the means of production employed. The result of this line of reasoning is a conceptualization of the falling rate of profit that suggests a cyclical movement, contingent upon specific initial conditions, rather than a tendency that ultimately asserts itself despite the presence of counteracting factors. Empirically speaking, therefore, a fall in the rate of profit is by no means ruled out. However, it can no longer be ascribed the status of a universal law. Consequently, the very self-conception of Marxian theory as a, quote, positive science of the dissolution of bourgeois society, end quote, can no longer be sustained. Ultimately, Marx drew conclusions regarding secular trends, driven by his practical cognitive interest aimed at demonstrating a tendency toward collapse, that were not warranted by the premises of his theory of value. Three, the revolutionary subject in the late works, new heading. Zieferle now poses the question of how the objective potentials for self-destruction within bourgeois society, as posited by Marx, are supposed to, quote, translate into individual action, end quote. The early works, he argues, offered a theory of, quote, disenchantment that revealed itself to be a direct consequence of the social conditioning of consciousness among those actors who suffered most acutely under capitalism and who stood in an extraterritorial relationship to it. Accordingly, for the proletariat, all bourgeois ideals and patterns of legitimation appeared as mere interest-driven prejudices. In their perception, owing to the universal pervasiveness of commodity relations, these ideals had given way to a naked illusion-free rationality of economic valorization. The materialist explanation of forms of thought had thus, in principle, precluded an imminent explanation of, quote, system-conformist behavior within the working class, end quote, derived from the internal dynamics of capitalist conditions of socialization. In its stead, Marx tended to resort to interpretive frameworks verging on conspiracy theories, the, quote, betrayal by leaders, end quote, or economism, the, quote, labor aristocracy, end quote, to account for the defects suffered by the labor movement. With the systematic introduction, in his later works, of the distinctions between essence and appearance, core structure and surface, and concept and mystification within the capitalist mode of production, this approach, it is argued, has become obsolete. Marx's theory of the forms of consciousness, explicated in Capital, the book, permits an examination of the spontaneous, self-legitimating potentials of bourgeois society that moves beyond the manipulative machinations of bourgeois ideologues. It explains the fully developed, domination-affirming systems of thought primarily as a systematization of the objectively induced, practical common sense of social actors, while recognizing that these mystifications operate in a manner that is not specific to any single class. However, this also renders the very constitution of the revolutionary subject a serious problem. For now, the reproduction of system-conforming patterns of thought and behavior emerges as the standard diagnostic finding
of the critique of political economy, and the mystifications inherent in an objectively self-reflecting practice, permanently equip commodity owners with interpretive frameworks whose plausibility is robust, enough to withstand the scrutiny of an emancipatory enlightenment-oriented practice. According to Zieferle, Marx ought, within the framework of his critique of political economy, to have identified points of rupture within the quote, objective context of delusion, end quote, and systematically link these to the everyday experiences of those offering their labor power, in order to provide a materialist foundation for the process of demystifying empirical class consciousness. Quote, yet this does not happen, end quote. Instead, disregarding his own insights regarding the critique of ideology and relying solely on historical metaphysical convictions, unrelated to those insights, as well as on contingent contemporary experiences, Marx clings to the proletariat as the subject called upon by the prevailing social conditions, to undertake revolutionary action. According to Zieferle, the fact that proletarian class consciousness in particular, within the categorical framework of the critique of political economy, is revealed to be mystified, and that the gravitational pull of capital's empirical surface permits even contradictory experiences to be integrated into its inverted perceptual matrix, is now demonstrated, proceeding from the objective illusion of the wage form as the quote, mystifying center, end quote, of the capitalist formal nexus, all the way to the quote, Trinitarian formula, end quote, of the developed surface. According to Marx, while freedom and equality are indeed real determinations of individuals acting as agents of circulation, they prove to be mere illusion when projected onto the process of production and of the overall reproduction of capital. This ideological misrecognition is a systematic product of the specific exchange relation between worker and capitalist, the wage form. Since within this form, the division of the working day into necessary labor time, required for the reproduction of the value of labor power, and surplus labor time, which is appropriated gratuitously by the owner of the means of production, becomes invisible, thereby creating the illusion that the capitalist pays not for the value of labor power, but for the value of the entire day's labor individually expended. The capitalist production relation itself appears, from the perspective of the circulation process, as a relation of equality. It is upon this class indiscriminate effect of misrecognition that both the utopian critique and the consistent apologia for the capitalist mode of production construct their respective narratives. Quote, upon this form of appearance, which renders the actual relation invisible and reveals precisely its opposite, rest all the juridical notions of both the worker and the capitalist, all the mystifications of the capitalist mode of production, all its illusions of freedom, and all the apologetic humbug of vulgar economics. And co. For Marx, this spontaneous self-mystification of the capitalist production relation through the wage form constitutes at the same time an essential basis for the reification of social relations, both in everyday consciousness and in political economy, culminating in the so-called Trinitarian formula. The fact that labor, landed property, and profit represent sources of income functioning as legal titles for the appropriation of portions of value is here inverted into the assumption that labor is the source of wages, land the source of ground rent, and capital the source of profit. If, therefore, wage labor coincides with labor in general, then wage labor coincides with the product of labor, and the portion of value represented by wages coincides with the value created by labor in general. Thereby, however, the other portions of value, profit and rent, appear equally independent vis-a-vis wages and must be seen as springing from their own sources, specifically distinct from and independent of labor. Thus profit from the means of production, and rent from the earth, and co. With this, the illusion of the quote, immediate fusion of the material relations of production with their historically and socially specific character, end quote, is brought to completion. In the Trinitarian formula, which in the guise of the contemporary theory of value has constituted an undisputed core element of bourgeois political economy since the time of Adam Smith, objectively mediated, historically specific production relations are thus not merely identified with sociality in general, but are, therefore, furthermore, imagined as nothing more than non-social relations between humans and things, and as properties inherent to things themselves. Thus, to the representatives of the revenue sources, the combination of the material elements, which alone can generate a use value, labor, land, and means of production, appear simultaneously as the source of the specific form determination of this use value, as generated within the capitalist production process. Since it is solely the combination of these, quote, factors of production, quote, that secures an income for each of their respective representatives. For instance, capital without labor power cannot valorize itself, nor can labor power without capital sustain itself. A shared interest exists among this trinity, quote, in the objective value nature of the product, unquote. A conflict among the owners of these revenue sources, who appear to stand on equal footing, arises solely with regard to their quantitative share of the value product, quote. The struggle among private owners thus manifests itself in its original form as a struggle over distribution, specifically over the magnitude of their respective revenues. The relationship as such, that is, the very legitimacy of the individual sources, is in the course of this struggle simultaneously affirmed and reproduced, unquote. According to Zifferla, the original class interests of the proletariat are all inherent to the frame of reference of the socialization of value. They necessarily imply an interest in a functioning process of capital reproduction. Common to both workers and capitalists, albeit often enforceable only through state regulation, is the, quote, perspective of regard for value formation, quote, as a systematic a priori of their social existence. All interest structures and demands of the owners of labor power resulting from the class antagonism remain within the context of the mystified surface of bourgeois society, yet are in this regard nonetheless entirely grounded in reality. One, the interest in preserving labor power as a source of revenue manifests itself as a demand to safeguard the status of the labor power owner as a private proprietor, as a demand for, quote, life and, quote, health. In the exchange relationship between capitalist and worker, labor power is indeed purchased as a commodity possessing a specific value. However, labor itself is consumed as a value-creating activity. In this process, the actual consumption of the commodity falls outside the sphere of circulation and is therefore not subject to the laws governing that sphere, specifically the principle of equivalence. Consequently, the length of the necessary working day, within which the value of labor power is reproduced, does not automatically determine the length of the total working day, nor are the limits of the total working day defined by the laws of commodity exchange. Yet it is not merely the duration of labor that eludes the worker, but also control over its nature, intensity, and technical conditions. For as a seller, the worker possesses no right to assert claims against the buyer's objectives regarding the consumption of the commodity, without in the slightest degree infringing upon the wage-labor relation itself. Reductions in working hours and statutory regulations governing working conditions are, within the context of the class struggle, fought for and won, thereby becoming, quote, themselves the subject of the contract between the owners of labor power and the owners of the means of production, unquote. Two, the struggle to secure the highest possible income takes the form of a demand for a, quote, just wage or, quote, social justice. Based on the mystification of wages, material inequalities among the owners of revenue sources are perceived as social injustice, an injustice to be remedied through the struggle for the, quote, full product of labor, unquote, or the, quote, just price of the commodity labor power. More radical efforts to raise wages beyond the value of labor power quickly lead to the, quote, experience of the elemental force of the objective constraints of capitalist production, end quote. Ultimately, these efforts result in a decline in the rate of surplus value and to stagnation of accumulation, a consequence that in turn jeopardizes the fundamental condition of existence for the working class, the realization of the value of its labor power. Conversely, on the basis of systematic increases in productivity, which within the framework of capital's, quote, productivity fetish, and quote, since the combination of labor powers and their combination with the means of production is instigated solely by capital's act of purchase, their productivity appears to emanate from capital itself, or interpreted as the fruit of capital. Real wages may rise despite a constant ratio between the variable component of capital and surplus value, because the value of the means of subsistence declines. Thus, quote, economic growth, becomes the most tenacious source of legitimation for capital, end quote. 3. The striving for a continuous flow of revenue ultimately articulates itself as a desire for, quote, social security, quote, jobs, and, quote, welfare state provision, end quote. Even the existential contingency of the working class's life situation, which, while rooted in separation from the conditions for the realization of its labor power, finds its most glaring expression in the cyclical crisis structure of capitalist dynamics, leads against the backdrop of the assumption that value form reproduction is, quote, natural, to demands and measures on the part of the labor movement that remain purely imminent. All welfare state interventions, from the insurance system to counter-cyclical economic policy, are, quote, adapted to the socio-economic framework conditions of capital, end quote. Far from representing a counter-principle to the, quote, political economy of capital, end quote, the successes of the labor movement in fighting for state regulation of the valorization strategies of individual capitals actually serve, according to Zieferle, to secure the continued existence of total capital against the immediate interest of individual capitals. The competition-driven dynamic of surplus value production, achieved through the absolute prolongation of the working day, would, in the long run, undermine the material conditions of existence for the valorization process itself, thereby resulting in the self-destruction of capital. The systemic requirements of capital reproduction, therefore, implied a shift, quote, from the extensive to the intensive production of surplus value, end quote. However, since total capital exists only as an uncoordinated, competing aggregate of individual capitals, a transition to the production of relative surplus value could not be expected to emerge from within capital itself. Quote, it is at this juncture that the reform movement of the working class intervenes, wresting capital's future interest from its immediate present-day interest, end quote. Thus, while capital is indeed, quote, steering toward a normal working day by its own interest, end quote, as Marx demonstrates using the English example, it is ultimately compelled to realize these long-term interests only through a complex web of social power relations, emphasizing labor organizations, state officials, competing factions of capital, and others, and by means of the extra-economic coercive power of the state. Contrary to Marx's own intentions, which, as Meyer previously argued and simultaneously naively affirmed, aimed at a dialectic of, quote, reform and revolution, end quote, a perspective that also lends plausibility to the notion of a victorious, quote, political economy of the working class, end quote. Zieferle argues that Marx's chapter on the struggle for the normal working day actually demonstrates that within the framework of Zieferle's own approach, quote, the system reproductive function of the labor movement can be articulated, end quote. Thus, the constitution of the working class into a political movement must not be confused with the beginning of the end of bourgeois society. nor should state intervention acting as the agency of the particularization of general interest of commodity owners and the quote institutionalization of non-catastrophic conflict resolution and quote in the form of the democratic republic be confused with the quote dissolution form of bourgeois society and quote as Marx still surmised in the 1850s. He conflated the phase of capitalist constitution during which proletarianized direct producers were still rebelling through defensive struggles against the propertylessness of their new mode of existence and the quote behavioral demands and quote imposed by industrial labor discipline, with the phase of dissolution of modern commodity-based relations of production. However, in light of Z. Ferla's thesis, the question arises, should Marx not then have felt a closer affinity with Luddism than with the organized labor movement? Unquestionably, however, from the standpoint of revolutionary theory, he mistook specific features of a not yet consolidated bourgeois society for its essential nature or its mode of dissolution, even though concurrently, through his critique of political economy, he is conceptually able to grasp precisely those elements that, quote, lend flexibility and stability, end quote, to capitalism. According to Z. Ferla, a gradual evolution from the proletariat's imminent material class interest toward a revolutionary perspective, a class-specific tendency toward demystification and system transcendence, is effectively precluded by the very inclusion of the, quote, ideological gravity, end quote, of the surface of capital. The mere experience of class-specific inequalities and unfreedoms, he argues, does not enable actors to draw any conclusions regarding the specific form, and thus the alterability of economic relations. Marx himself occasionally reflected upon this dynamic, noting the cross-class character of the practically induced naturalization of social relations, as well as the largely illusory notions of freedom, equality, and property. Ultimately, even the proletariat, quote, acknowledges the imperatives of the capitalist mode of production as, quote, self-evident natural laws, and quote, integrative behavior on the part of the working class is therefore less of a puzzle than our revolutionary intentions, end quote. Consequently, the connection between proletarian class identity and conflict awareness on the one hand and revolutionary consciousness on the other ultimately becomes entirely contingent. This diagnosis is supported by the revised wage theory presented in Marx's Capital. Like Moll, Z. Ferla observes that here only the decline in the value share of variable capital relative to surplus value is theoretically substantiated. Yet such production of relative surplus value achieved through a reduction in the value of workers' subsistence goods and a simultaneous increase in the rate of surplus value actually implies a constant or even rising real wage. However, unlike the trajectory of real wages, a divergence in value relations during the accumulation process, which is, quote, empirically ascertainable only with extreme difficulty, end quote, is ill-suited to explain the, quote, inevitable formation of oppositional consciousness. Quote, impoverishment that is not sensually experienced as such as, quote, hardship, serve as an expression of, quote, necessity, end quote, unquote. Nevertheless, in order to establish a connection between objective, quote, impoverishment and the formation of revolutionary consciousness, Marx now, quote, reintroduces the theory of absolute impoverishment by way of the theory of employment, end quote. He begins by developing a model of cyclical process governing employment and wage trends. During favorable economic conditions, the demand for labor rises, thereby reducing competition among workers, a fact that enhances the proletariat's prospects for securing higher wages. The successful enforcement of a higher nominal wage level, in turn, adversely affects the profit rate in the long run, as an ever-increasing share of the newly produced value is now allocated to the variable capital component. The resulting stagnation in production leads to a decline in labor market demand, a significant displacement of workers, and ultimately intensified competitive pressure among the working class.
factors that drive wages down to a level more favorable to capital, thereby leading to a rising profit rate. Thereby leading to rising profit rates. Thus, a model of fluctuating equilibrium is developed here, one that establishes itself through the interplay of opposing tendencies, as at the falling rate of profit, which, too, initially exhibits countervailing forces. Marx posits a tendency that, in the long run, asserts itself through the cyclical movement. Accordingly, the process of accumulation does indeed entail an employment effect. A surplus value is increasingly capitalized. More labor is integrated into the production process, thereby reducing the industrial reserve army. At the same time, however, driven by competitive pressures, accumulation is synonymous with a rising organic composition of capital. This results in a diminished demand for labor power and a growing displacement effect. Although Marx fully acknowledges that amidst increasing accumulation, a decline in the, quote, relative magnitude of the variable component of capital by no means preclude an increase in its absolute magnitude, end quote. A scenario that admittedly presupposes that real wages grow at a slower pace than productivity. He nonetheless posits that the displacement of labor power resulting from the increasing technological character of the production process cannot be compensated for. Quote, the mechanism of capitalist production ensures that the absolute growth of capital is not accompanied by a corresponding increase in the general demand for labor, end quote. Thus, one may indeed speak of a theory regarding the, quote, tendential production of an industrial reserve army, end quote. A theory derived from the explanatory framework of the law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit. However, according to Zieferle, given the questionable nature of the premises underlying that law, the very status of this second assumption as a, quote, law collapses as well. The connection between these phenomena is held to be merely conditional, a, quote, purely empirical question, end quote. Only if the increase in productivity fails to offset the accompanying material growth in constant capital by reducing its value dimension, and only in the relative decline in the variable component of capital only if the relative decline in the variable component of capital is not counterbalanced by a corresponding absolute reduction in the value of labor power, i.e. the value of the means of subsistence entering into it. Only then does this lead to a falling rate of profit, real wage stagnation, and rising unemployment. However, the expansion of the, quote, industrial reserve army, driven by intensifying competition in the labor market, is said to result not merely in real wage stagnation, but in a decline of wages to the subsistence minimum. Thereby, Marx is held to have revived his earlier theory of absolute immiseration, quote, in a new complex manner, end quote. The diagnosis of immiseration, which, contrary to common belief, is to be understood not merely in a broad sense, but according to Zieferle, quite distinctly in its income-related dimension, represents for Marx the subjective side of the objective systemic limit. This diagnosis posits emancipatory, quote, enormous consciousness and revolutionary action as a, quote, product of the autodynamics of the movement of capital accumulation itself, end quote, finding its condensed expression in the depiction of the, quote, historical tendency in chapter 24.7 of Capital. Quote, at the conclusion of this exposition of bourgeois society and its historical tendency, Marx reiterates the very same argument that, at the inception of his formulation of the materialist conception of history, had served him to declare the role of the philosopher superfluous. Thus, in contrast to Moll, and in a manner entirely distinct from Meyer, Zieferle extrapolates from the very line of argumentation within Marx's Capital an objectivist theory of revolution, yet he argues this theory wrongly presents itself as a logical consequence of Marx's critique of political economy. Consequently, while a philosophy of history does indeed exist within the critique of political economy, It remains, contrary to Marx's own self-assessments, external to the scientific context of his theoretical foundation. Quote, the aspect of his theory pertaining to the theory of revolution is therefore its weakest point. This in no way diminishes its groundbreaking significance, yet what is one to make of the fact that 100 years later individuals still turn to this very weakness in search of answers to contemporary questions? Unquote. Okay. And that is the end of Chapter 3 of Part 3 of Ingo Elbef's Marx in the West, the new writing of Marx in the Federal Republic since 1965. Again, Part 3 of the book is titled The Crisis of Revolutionary Theory, and Chapter 3 of Part 3 is titled Critique of Political Economy versus Objectivist Model of Revolution, or the Objectivist Model of Revolution. The next chapter, Chapter 4 of Part 3, is titled Class and Contradiction. Thank you so much for listening. Hey everybody, these are the footnotes for Chapter 3 of Part 3 of Ingo Elbef's Marx in the West. Part 3 of the book is titled The Crisis of Revolutionary Theory. Chapter 3 is titled Critique of Political Economy versus Objectivist Model of Revolution. And again, don't have like the text immediately before me. I don't know what these footnotes connect to. So a lot of time it'll say it'll refer to things in the text or say this and then explain this. I don't know what this is. So I try to clarify that I don't know what it is, or that it's not clear what's being referenced. But if I don't assume that you do, I guess, or I don't know. Do it floats your boat. Footnote 9. Within the context of the labor movement, Lassalle's, quote, iron law of wages may be regarded as a classic example of the demographic wage theory. Footnote 20. Hera distinguishes this starting point, whatever this starting point is, based on the physical subsistence minimum, from a purely demographic wage theory. While Marx was initially influenced by the latter, he nevertheless attempted early on to, quote, break free from a purely population policy-based explanation, end quote, for wage stagnation around the subsistence minimum. Footnote 26. However, Marx already knew better as early as 1844. Quote, enjoyment is thus subsumed under capital, the enjoying individual under the capitalizing individual, whereas previously the opposite took place, end quote. Marx. Footnote, quote, let us recall that the simpler the labor is, the more easily it can be learned, and the fewer production costs are required to acquire it. The lower the wage sinks, for like the price of any other commodity, it is determined by the cost of production, end quote. Marx. Footnote 31. Gunther Hera already pointed this, whatever this is, out in 1973. In addition to the empirical descriptions found in the contemporary literature on pauperism, Marx's diagnosis of immiseration was reportedly supported by the positions of classical economics. Footnote 46. The thinkers of antiquity, quote, excused, for instance, the slavery of the one as means for the full human development of the other. But to preach the slavery of the masses in order to turn a few crude or semi-educated parvenus into, quote, eminent spinners, quote, extensive sausage makers, and, quote, influential black dealers, end quote. For that they lacked the specifically Christian organ, end quote.
Marx, cited in Mole. Footnote 63. See Marx's reference to the, quote, naive popular soil, end quote, into which, quote, the lightning bolt of thought, end quote, must strike. And footnote. Footnote, regarding Marxism, footnote 70. Moll accordingly states, quote, that human beings can overturn social relations only under the condition of free will and clear consciousness, end quote. Moll. Footnote 80. Habermas, following Adorno, has already pointed out this problematic immanent criticism. He therefore argues that social criticism should no longer be tied to, quote, contingent forms of bourgeois consciousness, but should instead shift to transcendental strategy of justification. Admittedly, however, much as his teacher did at times, he impermissibly conflates the concept of immanent ideology critique with the Marxian concept in general. Footnote 92, quote, before any positive growth of the actual working population could occur as a result of the wage increase, the period in which the industrial campaign must be waged and the battle fought and decided would have elapsed time and again, end quote. Marx. For a more detailed discussion of the determination of long-term wage movements by the process of capital accumulation, see Mandel, 1991. Footnote 94. This is Moll. Quote, if value is the center of fluctuating prices, then this center cannot lie, quote, as a rule and on average, end quote, above prices any more than it can lie below them, end quote. Moll. Footnote 96. Harrop, 1973, points out the determinants of the historico-moral element of the value of labor power. Already in the Grundrisse, Marx proceeds from the premise of a possible increase in the necessary needs of workers, their greater, quote, share in civilization, end quote, Marx. As examples, Marx cites the, quote, share that the worker takes in higher, including intellectual enjoyments, agitation for his own interest, subscribing to newspapers, attending lectures, educating children, developing taste, etc. Marx. Footnote 98. In contrast, Kretka and Zieferle assume that this also, whatever this is, brings wage development in general into focus. Footnote 100. Here, Moll does not address the connection between the struggle for the normal working day and the production of relative surplus value. Footnote 101. Both the theoretical context and the explicit formulations in these passages refute a theory of absolute immiseration. And these are those are references to passages from Mega. Footnote 111. And this is a quote from Mega. The class whose historical vocation is the overthrow of the capitalist mode of production and the ultimate abolition of classes, the proletariat, end quote. Marx. Quote, history is the judge, its executioner, the proletarian, end quote. That's at least, it might be Marx, but it's definitely from Mega. Footnote 112, Mega, quote, hand in hand with this centralization or the expropriation of many capitalists by a few, the cooperative form of the labor process develops on an ever-increasing scale. The conscious technical application of science, the systematic exploitation of the earth, the transformation of the instruments of labor into such as are only usable in common, the economizing of all means of production by their use as means of production of combined socialized labor, the entanglement of all nations in the net of the world market, and with this the international character of the capitalist regime, along with the constantly diminishing number of the magnates of capital, grows the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation, but also the revolt of the ever-swelling and by the mechanism of the capitalist process of production itself, trained, united, and organized working class. The monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production which is flourished with and under it. The centralization of the means of production and the socialization of labor reach a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. It is burst asunder. End quote. Mega, Marx. Footnote 120, quote, "It follows, therefore, that in proportion as capital accumulates, a lot of the work the lot of the worker, be the worker's payment what it may, high or low, must grow worse," end quote. Mega. The preceding passage does not speak of a material misery in the sense of limited opportunities for consumption, but rather of the intensification, de-skilling, specialization, fragmentation, and transformation of lifetime into working time, processes which give rise to the, quote, "most petty and hateful despotism," end quote. Mega. Wagner 1976 and Hera 1973 in particular draw attention to this theory of immiseration, which is no longer focused on the sphere of circulation. Hera notes, however, that the term, quote, "misery" is misleading when used to designate the perpetuated suffering inherent in labor, as well as the precarious and heteronomous situation of the working class. Footnote 123. For Eber 2005 as well, quote, "With his idea of capitalism's self-liquidation, Marx would be retracing the necessity, which he himself posited, of having to theoretically critique capitalism, that is, of having to perform theoretical work of enlightenment, in order to be able to take practical action against it," end quote. Christian Eber, 2005. Footnote 125. Marx strictly opposes theories of representation and the vanguard, theories that would later gain prominence within the socialist movement in the form of the Kautsky-Lenin model. Quote, "We cannot, therefore, associate with people who openly declare that the workers are too uneducated to liberate themselves and must instead be liberated from above," end quote. Marx. However, Moll's work lacks any reference to this passage. Footnote 149. Quote, "She is and remains an old woman. The withered and widowed Hegelian philosophy, who paints and adorns her body, parched into the most repulsive abstraction, and squints around all over Germany for a suitor," end quote. Marx Engels Werke, cited in Zieferle. Footnote 152. In Engels' report on the condition of the working class in England, however, Zieferle still detects residues of the philosophy-practice model found in the introduction. Footnote 155. Here, Zieferle 1979, where emphasis is placed on the word, quote, "for the time being," end quote, in the famous Marx citation. I don't know which citation is being referred to here. Footnote 160. Zieferle focuses in particular on the Marx Engels Werke. 6. Here, Marx initially observes, quote, "What the economists remark against the associations is correct," end quote. In his view, they are unsuited for reform and economically irrational. However, the economists failed to view them in terms of their hidden political function, a function Marx identifies as the, quote, "unification of the working class, the preparation for the overthrow of the entire old society," end quote. Marx. Thus, for Marx, a, quote, objective purpose, end quote, is at work here, a, quote, cunning of reason operating over the heads of the actors involved. And it's kind of a weird thing because it's kind of like a... that quote is from... the quotes in that sentence are from Zieferle. Footnote. See also the assertion regarding, quote, relative and absolute tendencies towards impoverishment in the Marx-Engels Werke 6. Quote, in the course of development, therefore, wages fall in two respects. First, relatively in proportion to the growth of general wealth. Second, absolutely insofar as the quantity of commodities the worker receives in exchange becomes ever smaller, end quote. Marx-Engels Werke. Footnote. See Marx-Engels Werke 3, where Marx asserts that the concepts criticized as, quote, ideological in the German ideology do not in fact exist for the masses. End footnote. Footnote 169, quote, only with this universal development of the productive forces is a universal intercourse among people established. Hence, on the one hand, the phenomenon of the, quote, propertyless mass is simultaneously created among all nations, general competition, making each of them dependent on the upheavals of the others, and finally, world historical, empirically universal individuals have taken the place of the local ones, end quote. Marx, cited in Zieferle. Quote, the workers, or at least that last quote is from the Mega, but it's cited in Zieferle. Quote, the workers have no fatherland, ... The national divisions and antagonisms among peoples are vanishing more and more already with the development of the bourgeoisie, with freedom of trade, the world market, the uniformity of industrial production, and the conditions of life corresponding to it. End quote. Marx-Engels Werke. And I believe that's the Communist Manifesto. Footnote 172. Quote, the question is whether humanity can fulfill its destiny without a radical revolutionizing of social conditions in Asia. If not, then England, whatever crimes it may have committed, was nonetheless the unconscious instrument of history in bringing about this revolution. End quote. Mega. Footnote 175. In his 1892 commentary on the Erfurt program, Kautsky radicalizes this trip, whatever trip that is, of the proletariat as a universal and extraterritorial class. It tends, he argues, to express only the, quote, positive aspects of contradictory capitalism. It stands for direct socialization, solidarity, monopolization, and internationalism, while nationalism, competition, etc. become, quote, increasingly ineffective for it, end quote. End quote, Kautsky. Footnote 180. Here one even finds the methodological overtones that interpret the analysis of the formal determination of simple circulation and its agents as a, quote, theoretical fiction, end quote, regarding the, quote, relations of simple commodity production, end quote. Quote, in the ideal typical construction of a society of small commodity producers, abstract labor is the center of social synthesis, without, however, touching the labor process itself, end quote. And that's from Zieferle. Footnote 184. Mega, quote, that exchange value, or more precisely, the monetary system, is indeed the system of freedom and equality, and that whatever stands in their way as a disturbance during the further development of the system constitutes disturbances imminent to it. Specifically, the very realization of equality and freedom, which reveal themselves as inequality and unfreedom, end quote. Zieferle. Footnote 188. Quote, the determination of simple circulation, quote, the determinations of simple circulation are in any case of no significance for the society of the third stage. The breach of the principle of equivalence as the imminent further development of the value form holds a progressive significance, given that the capitalist social form constitutes the immediate prelude to the emancipated society, end quote. Zieferle. Footnote 198. The quote riddle that the capitalist, who is concerned solely with the production of exchange value, constantly strives to lower the exchange value of commodities, end quote, is resolved. While in the Grundrisse, Marx still characterizes this fact as a quote processual contradiction, end quote, one through which quote production resting on exchange value collapses, end quote. He subsequently demonstrates it to be an imminent tendency of the capitalist mode of production through the theory of the production of relative surplus value. This theory is accompanied by the insight that the capitalist is not concerned with the magnitude of value of commodities, but rather with the surplus value quote objectified within them, and ultimately with the rate of profit. See on this point above all Heinrich, 1999. Footnote 202. As early as 1973, Flatov and Huisken refuted this interpretation of the quote road building section, end quote, of the Grundrisse, demonstrating that it is suitable neither as a general theory of universal material conditions of production nor for a phase theoretical or evolutionist interpretation. Footnote 206. Meinhard Kreit has subjected this topos, of quote, negative sublation, end quote, as found in Marx and in the quote market socialists, end quote. Johann Bischoff and his associates who draw upon it to a plausible critique, only insofar as the identity of owner and functioning capitalists were counted among the general formal determinations of capitalism, could the joint stock company be regarded as the form of its dissolution. According to Kreit, however, joint stock companies, the credit system, and comparable phenomena can, within the framework of Marxian theory, only be understood as phenomena that transcend the limitations of individual capitals. They by no means burst the boundaries of the capitalist formal determination of production, since they generate clearly functional effects for the developed valorization process. In the quote sublation argument, in quote, by contrast, quote, the contradiction that the autonomy of capitals requires forms of association becomes an opposition. In this opposition, one side, that of association, appears as the overcoming of the other side. In doing so, one blissfully abstracts from the specific character of the association, which in fact remains tethered to the very opposite of association, competition and self-referential valorization of capital. End quote. Kreit, 2000. Footnote 209. Marx does not claim to, quote, investigate a dynamic equilibrium of a series of intersecting factors. Rather, in the case of the profit rate, he ultimately sees the guarantor of the collapse of capitalism. End quote. Zieferle. Footnote 214. Mega, quote, this peculiar barrier testifies to the limitedness and merely historical transitory character of the capitalist mode of production, end quote. Mega. Quote, transitory and quote, capitalist inserted by Engels. Cited in Zieferle, 1979. Quote, not its susceptibility to criticism when measured against the standard of autonomy, but rather its objective completion its sublation, while still within its own identity, offers the guarantee that it is not the natural form of human life in general. Ferle. Footnote 217. Michael Heinrich has pointed out that the very concept of a rising technical composition is problematic, since heterogeneous quantities of use values cannot be brought into a ratio, either among themselves or with heterogeneous quantities of concrete labor. Zieferle's terminology, by contrast, is quite diffuse, e.g. when he speaks of the, quote, organic valued composition, end quote. Zieferle. This expression is nonsensical, since according to Marx, the organic composition designates precisely the value composition as determined by the technical composition. Footnote 221. However, it was Michael Heinrich who, in his detailed discussion of the law and the attempts to salvage it, first provided a sufficient foundation for this thesis. Quote, we find two variable quantities, the long-term direction of movement of which is known. However, the direction of movement of the rate of profit depends on the relative movement of these two quantities. Yet such a comparison cannot be made at all using merely qualitative information that relates solely to the direction of movement of the quantities being compared, end quote. At the same time, Heinrich demonstrates that dispensing with the law has absolutely no impact on Marx's crisis theory. Footnote 224. See Holtz, 1993. Quote, the claim that class position offers protection against this, bracket, against ideological consciousness, end bracket, was asserted by Marx himself primarily in political rather than theoretical writings, end quote. Holtz. Footnote 225. Zieferle, 1979, quote, relevant experiences must first be undergone, experiences against which the explanatory power of mystification can no longer hold up, before individuals will, of their own accord, arrive at a point where they feel a need for the enlightenment that critical science is able to provide, end quote. Zieferle. Footnote 229. More precisely formulated, the capitalist appropriates all products of labor and legitimately remunerates only a portion of their value, specifically that portion which constitutes the value of labor power. Footnote 232. From this arises the, quote, rational expression, end quote, quote, value of labor, end quote, which drives the representatives of classical economics into theoretical foundational aporias. It says rational, but isn't that supposed to say irrational? I don't know. Footnote 239. In the unconceptual transition of the political-economic determination of capital from a concept of quantities of goods, capital as a simple means of production, to a balance sheet concept, capital is simple money, which is itself merely an isolation, absolutization, and autonomization of specific partial moments of the capitalist process, commodity and money, vis-a-vis one another. The illusion of the unmediated self-positing of value is taken to such an extreme that one is forced to posit a, quote, occult quality, bracket, of the same, and bracket, to be unequal to itself, end quote. Quote, where 4 equals 5, end quote. Mega. Footnote 244. Marx was already aware of this in 1847, though without, however, drawing any consequences for revolutionary theory from it. Quote, as long as the wage labor is a wage laborer, his lot depends on capital. That is the much vaunted community of interest between worker and capitalist, end quote. The consequences of the interest shared by all owners of revenue sources is the reproduction of capitalist relations of production. Quote, securing ownership of the, quote, revenue source, labor, end quote, actually means securing one's own non-ownership. An interest in a continuous flow of revenue means, nothing other than securing the precondition for a smooth process of capital valorization, end quote. However, Flatov and Huisken juxtapose the self-interpretation of the owners of labor power as owners of revenue sources, and their self-interpretation as class individuals in an unmediated fashion. Footnote 245. In doing so, Zieferle draws upon the Marxistische Gruppe, Marxist group. Neither the Marxist group nor Flatov-Huisken, however, draw any consequences for revolutionary theory from this. Thus, in the work of Flatov and Huisken, despite their own critique of the, quote, naive derivation, end quote, of revolutionary class consciousness on the part of the PKA, they nevertheless, once again without justification, introduced the, quote, system-shattering action, end quote, of the working class, asserting that there, quote, always resides within it, quite independently of its consciousness, the germ of a transitory movement, end quote. Flatov and Huisken. Footnote 246, or as Zeidel, 1996, observes, quote, as long as social productive forces remain the productive forces of capital, just so long does the fact that the female workers receive only a fraction of the value product they produce remain a necessary precondition for the reproduction of social wealth, and by extension a precondition of their own share in it, the, quote, instrumental social consciousness, end quote, namely the belief that female workers can only fare well if capital itself fares well, parenthesis, i.e. if it is able to accumulate effectively, end parenthesis, reflects this state of affairs, bracket, in a distorted manner, end bracket, end quote. Zeidel, 1996. Footnote 252, quote, the struggle over the legal limitation of working hours, this is from Mega, quote, the struggle over the legal limitation of working hours raged all the more fiercely the more it, aside from startled greed, in fact struck at the great issue in dispute, the issue between the blind rule of the laws of supply and demand, which constitute the political economy of the middle class, and the control of social production by social insight and foresight, which constitutes the political economy of the working class. The 10 Hours Bill was therefore not merely a great political achievement. It was the victory of a principle. For the first time, the political economy of the middle class succumbed in broad daylight before the political economy of the working class, end quote. Zieferle. Footnote 262. For according to Marx, increasing employment relative to a given amount of variable capital is supposed to imply this, whatever this is. If the variable component of capital rises with the nominal wage, the real wage as well, this would reduce the share of the surplus value expended on constant capital. However, this is precluded by Marx's thesis regarding the correlation between a rising technical composition and a rising value composition. Footnote 264, regarding the critique of the, quote, general law of capitalist accumulation, end quote, see also Heinrich 1999 and Elmers 2007. And there's a quote from Mega, quote, consequently, is the general tendency of capitalist production not to raise the average wage standard, but to lower it, or to depress the value of labor more or less to its minimum limit, end quote. Marx, cited in Zieferle 1979, is telling that Zieferle cites no evidence for this thesis from Marx's Capital. For nowhere therein is there to be found any statement regarding, quote, a greater or lesser quantity of consumer goods available to working class households, end quote. Heinrich, 1999. Footnote 267. As suggested in Marx's formulation, quote, it follows, therefore, that as capital accumulates, the situation of the worker, whatever his remuneration, high or low, must deteriorate, end quote. Marx. Footnote 268, quote, the recognition of the products as his own and the judgment of the separation from the conditions of his realization as an improper, coercive one, is an enormous consciousness. It is itself the product of the mode of production resting on capital, and is just as much the knell to its doom as with the slave's consciousness that he cannot be the property of a third party. With his consciousness as a person, slavery merely vegetates on as an artificial existence and has ceased to be able to endure as a basis of production. End quote. Marx. And that's the end of the footnotes to Chapter 3 of Part 3 of Ingo Elbef's Marx in the West. Part 3 of the book is titled The Crisis of Revolutionary Theory. Chapter 3 is titled Critique of Political Economy versus Objectivist Model of Revolution. Thank you so much for listening.